we go. All right, there we go. And we will be 1 second, so just hold on for 1 minute and we will be on our way. Excuse me. All right. We're going to be starting in about a minute and a half or so, so just hold on tight and we will be on our way. So if you can let me know if the sound is okay, then if the sound and picture are okay, then we'll be on our way. So let's see. Great. All right, we'll be up and running in 1 moment. So just hold on tight, my friends. And today will be, oh, Jared is here. Hello, happy birthday, my friend. Please have a very nice birthday, and please be well, my friend. Casual Glutton is here. Hello. Mr. Liam is here. Hello. Andrew Conger is here. Hello. Matthias Ripstein is here. Hello. Oh, gosh. Cooper Glover 1972 is here. Hello. Alan is here. Hello. Ghetto Matt is here. Hello. Well, Zyrother is here. Hello. Will Rem is here. Hello. Oh, gosh. Lots of people. So we'll be up and running in about 30 seconds. So just hold on tight. Today's film is On Her Majesty's Secret Service. The film, not the book. From 1969. Peter Hunt, starring George Lazenby. Produced by Albert R. Cobby Broccoli and Harry Saltzman. I hope all of you are doing very well. Oh, there's one thing I have to check. Just give me 1 second here. Sorry about this. Okay, so, all right, my friends, I think we can get started. So, thank you very much, and I hope the sound and picture are coming through okay, and if so, then let's get started. So, greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I very much hope that this video live stream finds you well. Today, we are going to be talking about this film right here, which is from 1969, On Her Majesty's Secret Service. So by my count, this is the 6th James Bond film in the Eon Productions James Bond film series, starting with Dr. No and then continuing through From Russia with Love, Goldfinger, Thunderball, and You Only Live Twice. And then comes along this film, On Her Majesty's Secret Service, to at the end of the 60s. And what a film this is. This is a very strong film, in my opinion, for many reasons. And hopefully I'll try to get into some of the reasoning as to why I think this is indeed a very strong film, perhaps one of the strongest films in this Eon James Bond film series. And so hopefully I'll try to share with you some thoughts I have about that. But before I go any further, let me say that today is a live stream, so please feel free to join us if you would like in the live chat. I will of course do my best to keep up with the live chat as it is happening, but please understand that I am only human, and so I might miss a comment here, there, or quite a few in fact, but I will try my best to keep up. Now, some preliminary points before we get underway with this film. Excuse me. First of all, this is live, so I will be talking about this film, On Her Majesty's Secret Service. Now, there are many films in the James Bond series, as you know, many films, and so the point of this live stream won't be necessarily to talk about the entirety of the series as a whole. My focus will be almost entirely on Her Majesty's Secret Service, although there might be occasions where I might every now and again make some reference to another Bond film. But if that happens, I will try to be as vague as possible, so as not to go into too much detail about the other James Bond films. Again, my focus tonight will be on Her Majesty's Secret Service. And with that in mind, please feel free to talk in the live chat amongst yourselves. Please feel free to meet other people, get to know each other, and settle in, and please enjoy. As always, I must ask that as you've always shown me such great respect, and even where there is disagreement, you've always shown me a lot of respect and courtesy and consideration, and so I'm always very grateful for that. And you've always shown other people around you and in this particular channel, you've always shown other people respect and courtesy, and even where there is disagreement, it is always a healthy disagreement, it is always a nice rigorous discussion, and it has always been under the tone of mutual respect, and I've appreciated it up to now, and I know, my dear friends, I know I can trust you to continue that today, continue that spirit today. So thank you very much in advance for doing that for me. As always, I really, really appreciate the kindness and consideration you give to others. And we can go forward there because we all have the same thing in common, which is our love of cinema. So that is something that should just everyone, I know everyone keeps that in mind. So I thank you for that in advance. And speaking of the live chat, if you want to ask me any question or you want to make any comment to me, please feel free to do so in the live chat. I'm very open to any kind of comment or question. However, please note that I will be focusing my energies and attention today on this film, on Her Majesty's Secret Service. So if you have any question or comment for me that is with respect to anything other than on Her Majesty's Secret Service, I must apologize, but I might just very, how should I put it? Just very respectfully, just maybe skip over your comment, but please feel free to leave a comment or question as in the comment section of this particular video or any other video, and I will do my best to respond. It might take me a while, but I will certainly do my best. So I just ask for your understanding on that regard. And let's see. Oh yes, so the other thing is, this is a film that, as I say, I'm coming at this as a fan of this particular series of films, having seen a number of these films, including this one, for a number of times ever since I was a little kid, and I've grown up with them. And even up to now, I've watched them on a fairly regular basis. So I'm coming at this as a fan, and I'm not coming at this as a kind of how should I put it? I'm not coming at this as an expert or someone who has studied this film, or anyone who has any direct relation to the production or anything like that. So I don't come at this with any claim to any sort of high-level expertise or anything like that. I just come at this as a fan, and so I will certainly do my best to express to you just how I feel about this film in that context, and I think we can go from there. And let's see. Oh yes, and of course I will be talking about spoilers with respect to this film. And so if you have not seen this film on Her Majesty's Secret Service, then please, I urge you to stop this live stream and turn it off, and you can watch this film in your spare time, or at your earliest convenience, and then you can always come back, because this live stream will be uploaded, or it should be uploaded as a video after it is over. It might take I think it takes a little bit longer these days, maybe several hours or 12 hours or something, but it will be uploaded, and once it is, you can always return, and you can always share with me your thoughts about this particular film on Her Majesty's Secret Service. And so I'll be very thrilled to hear your thoughts on that occasion when you've seen the film. And let's see. Oh yes, and I should say also that I just want to give a quick shout out to our dear friends, Mainly Movies, who is currently doing her own James Bond film series retrospective review on her YouTube channel. Again, Mainly Movies. So please check out that channel if you have not done so already. Also, our dear friend Cine Arts is also doing his own James Bond retrospective, which is very interesting. And so please visit his channel. Again, once again, Cine Arts. Please visit his channel and check out his James Bond retrospective series. So they're both doing a really good job. Also, there are a number of other YouTubers who are doing James Bond series, and so if you are one of them, please feel free to let me know, and I will certainly mention your channel when I can, and we can go from there. And once again, please note that I will try to keep doing these live streams with respect to the James Bond films going forward. So this won't be the only one. Fingers crossed if this goes well. So there's that. So and finally, as I say, I will try to address all the comments in the live stream. But if for whatever reason I cannot, please forgive me. If I have to skip over a comment, I have to do so. So I ask for your understanding in advance. But I'll certainly do my best to keep up with the chat. But okay, so with that in mind, let us begin. And this is as I say, the sixth James Bond film in the Eon film series of the films produced by Albert R. Cubby Broccoli and Harry Saltzman. And this is directed by Peter Hunt. This stars George Lazenby and Diana Rigg and Telly Savalas and others. And this is a very unique work, in my opinion, not only in the context of James Bond films and not only in the context of this kind of drama action, but also just in general. It has a certain quirkiness of style, and it has a very interesting upbeat tone to it and also a downbeat tone to it, which is something that I'll try to get into and over the course of this live stream to the best of my ability. It is, of course, based off of the novel On Her Majesty's Secret Service by Ian Fleming. And if you haven't read the novel, I would strongly suggest that you do. I actually have the novel. It's out of reach, but it's right there on the shelf there. And so I was planning, well, actually, I'm not planning to do any kind of comparison between the film and the novel. There are some differences, but there are a lot of things that are similar between the book and the film, and the book is really excellent. And so if you're interested in getting a little flavor of the type of writing that Ian Fleming can do when he's really at his best, as it were, then I would suggest checking out On Her Majesty's Secret Service, the novel. But so I won't be speaking, though, directly about the novel. Just in maybe there might be some points where I might bring it up, but just in passing. But this is therefore the film that is based off of the novel, again directed by Peter Hunt, screenplay by Richard Maybaum, and this is the first and only outing with George Lazenby as James Bond 007. And there have been many documentaries included, for instance, on this DVD, also on the Blu-ray. I don't know if you know the Blu-ray set as well. There have been many Blu-ray releases of this, as many of you know. And so, but this is the DVD, the earlier, older DVD, which I actually rely upon the most. But there have been many documentaries made, many books written about George Lazenby's run as James Bond and everything that led up to his being cast, the production process, and everything that happened afterwards. And so some of you may know it was a sort of maybe interesting process, to say the least, with respect to George Lazenby's run. But my focus I will try to focus on the effect of his performance on screen, what he left behind in terms of how he performed as the role of James Bond, at least in my view. And I'll try to let you know how I think his performance somehow affects how I view this particular film, because it does have a certain effect. As you know, Sean Connery was the actor that played James Bond prior to George Lazenby, all the way up to You Only Live Twice, and in fact he returns again. But here we have the first actor to play James Bond after Sean Connery. And while there are many similarities that I think the filmmakers, and indeed the actor, I think are trying to make in terms of maybe creating an echo of Sean Connery, in terms of the look, the hair, the mannerisms, the way that the suits are worn, etc. There are marked differences, and very, very noticeable differences. And I would say that this is very much a de-Connerized, is that a word? De-Conneryized Bond in many respects. It is also a little bit of a sort of a conundrum, because on the one hand, I do think that this is a very de-Conneryized Bond, in that this is very different from Connery. There are many aspects of the film that are very different from the Connery era, but at the same time the film is trying to make connections with specific Connery films, in particular the films directed by Terence Young, those being Dr. No, From Russia with Love, and Thunderball. And so I think that is very significant for those of you who know that the directors Peter Hunt, and Peter Hunt in particular had a great respect and fondness for the works of Terence Young, which probably explains why I think there are many references made more to Dr. No, From Russia with Love, and Thunderball than, let's say, the other non-Terence Young directed films of the Connery era. But that's something that I'll try to get into a little bit later as well. So the George Lazenby aspect of the film is very significant, and I'll try to talk about that later. The fact that this is trying to be a Connery Bond, trying to make connections to Connery Bond films, but also trying to somehow it feels like its own separate thing, that is also very significant. I'll try to talk about that as well. And there are some amazing action set pieces to this film. I think this is a really tight, really excellent film that has a very interesting way about its plot progression and the way it introduces narrative information, which I'll try to get into a little bit as well. Also, I find it to be highly structured. Now, I'm not sure if this structure was done on purpose, but there is a strong structure to this film. There's many examples of, for example, foreshadowing. Things that happen early in the film seem to echo, or they seem to come back later in the film. There's an interesting use of foreground and background shots. There's an interesting use of zooms, zoom in, zoom outs, in particular in relation to James Bond himself and when he acts or when he's knocked out or something like that. There's there are some interesting dimensions with respect to Telly Savalas as Blofeld, and Diana Rigg as Tracy, and Gabriella Ferzetti, and many others. And so I do want to try to bring as many of these aspects into the film or into the discussion as possible. I guess without getting into too many details, let me also say that, well, actually, let me save that for a moment, and let me just go to the live chat first. That'll be sort of my opening salvo, and let me just go to the live chat and see what is going on. And already there is a lot of activity. I'm very impressed, so thank you very much. Zyrother's here, hello. Lucas Prada Flores is here, hello. David is here. David Recca is here, hello. Mainly Movies, our dear friend. Please check out Mainly Movies' channel. She's doing a great job with her James Bond films reviews, so well done, my friend. Dinobot Kiryu is here. Zyrother says, shout out to the John Barry score. Definitely my favorite. Yes, I will try to mention that later as well. Let's see, Dinobot Curious says, I think it's all right. I mean, there's a bunch of other Bond films I prefer, but I guess Lazenby wasn't that bad. I guess he just couldn't live up to Connery at the time. Yeah, I will try to get back to Lazenby and this particular role. Again, this was his only outing as James Bond, and I think that is very That is very significant. Okay, just scrolling down. Dennis A says, hi, Daisuke, first time I have been able to get up early enough to watch you on live. Love your channel. I've seen your Vertigo and Heat reviews. Really enjoyed watching the content. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for waking up early. I'm sorry I can't accommodate the schedule better, but thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Let's see. Dinobot Q provides a ranking. Let's see. Okay, Randy Pella is here. Hello. Let's see. Jace, is that right? I hope I get that pronunciation correct. You say one of the best storylines of the series, no doubt. Cooper Glover 1972 is here. Skulder 22 is here. Let's see. Tomahawk 238 is here. Let's see. Oh, this is great. Gwolfgratz, hello, my dear friend. And Alan is here, yes. Alan, I love the abundance of fisticuffs in the film, hand-to-hand combat, and I don't believe that George's performance was as awful as he has been portrayed. Not Academy Award worthy, but not awful. Okay, so actually, this reminds me. Okay, let's begin here. Okay, so let me start with. Let me start with just a quick, brief introduction, and then I will get to what Alan's comment reminds me of, which is the opening sequence. Okay, so just to give a brief background about my experience with this film. So I have been watching James Bond films for quite a number of years, since I was a little kid. So I might have mentioned this before. I was born in '79, so I was growing up in the '80s. So the first film I remember seeing was, in fact, A View to a Kill and The Living Daylights. And I think I saw License to Kill in the movie theater. Now that's certainly an experience to watch that in the movie theater as a kid, if you know that film. But all throughout that time also, I was watching and rewatching the James Bond films as they were being played on TV, and I was trying to get my hands on the VHS tapes and rent them and do that. My parents were also big fans. My mother in particular was a big fan of Sean Connery. But then there was this film, On Her Majesty's Secret Service, and so this would always be the one that would be the sort of, what's the phrase, odd man out type of thing, because this would always be the one that felt a little bit different from the others. It felt like it was put together a little bit differently. The brisk movement of the way the cameras moved, the way the scenes flowed from one place to another. The fact that M wasn't necessarily in the foreground as much; she was more in the background. And in fact, one can argue that the M role was basically taken over by Draco and his particular characterization. You know, if you think about it, right, the fact that he meets Bond early on in the film in his little office, right? But today's the 13th, right? I'm superstitious, which is a great, nice twist on a little reference to From Russia with Love. But the fact that we have this office scene, not between M and Bond, although there is a little bit of that. The main office scene in this film is in fact between Draco and Bond. So in fact, Draco could be seen to be almost fulfilling the M role, giving Bond, in a sense, a kind of assignment. It's a twofold assignment. First is, of course, giving him certain information about the lawyer, Gumboldt, which will then lead Bond to Count de Blochamp, who we will later realize is Blofeld in the flesh, without earlobes, of course. But the other sort of assignment, if you want to call it that, and I know it's a little bit of a rude way of putting it, but I'll try to explain myself, is of course the proposition that Draco gives to Bond about wanting Bond to marry his daughter, Tracy. And so I always see that but Draco seems to be filling in the M role, and everyone else who is the usual cast of characters at Universal Exports seems to be a little bit not necessarily fulfilling their roles. Or in other words, we're seeing them in different aspects of their character. We see M in his house for the first time. We see a little bit of rapport between Moneypenny and Bond, but also between Moneypenny and M. What would I do without you, Miss Moneypenny? Thank you. And we also see Q out of his element, not necessarily giving us any sort of gadget, except perhaps for a little bit of a glimpse into, radioactive lint, of course. But we also see him prominently in sort of private mode, as it were, at the end of the film when everyone is gathered for the wedding, of course. And so my point is that this seems like a film that, with all those examples, is a very different kind of Bond film from what we've seen up to now. We've always seen Bond meeting M in the office, getting the assignment, maybe doing a little bit of flirting with Moneypenny, then going to get his gadgets. It later became established that it would be from Q, and going off on his adventure or on his mission. Here, there's a similar sort of thing, but as you can see, it's laid out in quite a different way. There are no gadgets necessarily, for the most part. There is one little huge suitcase of a safe opener kind of gadget, but that's pretty much it. And there is no M speaking with Bond in the office. I mean, the only time we get a significant scene with M and Bond in the office at Universal Exports, there are two significant scenes. One where basically, or both scenes, basically M is really berating Bond or being angry at Bond and saying to stand down from his mission. You're not, Operation Bedlam is dead, he says in the latter scene. And so this is very antithetical to the typical M scenes that we see in the films up to here. M giving him missions in the other films, whereas here in On Her Majesty's Secret Service, it's very antithetical. M is basically negating Bond's mission, disappointed in his lack of progress in Operation Bedlam, and that sort of thing. And so, so this feels, in many respects, to be, in many senses of the word, a film that is different from the rest of the series, almost antithetical to the rest of the series. And also, we see a very heartfelt romance, arguably perhaps for the first time in the series. Although we have had some very strong romantic interests that have developed in the course of the series up to now. But I think arguably Tracy and Bond, and talking about Tracy, the Diana Rigg character, is one of the strongest characters I think we've come across in a Bond film up to now, and her character is very complex, very richly detailed, and it's a tremendous dramatic arc that we see that particular character, Tracy's character, undergo throughout the film. And so I bring these examples up at the outset to say that whenever I saw this film as a kid and growing up, and even now, I always thought of this as the one that was different from the others. Things happen to Bond that don't necessarily happen to Bond in the other films necessarily, per se, at least up to now. This never happened to the other fella, right? So my point is that, therefore, this always held a kind of special, almost mysterious mystique in my eyes. And this was also added further by the fact that Bond's mission seems to be very low-key. It almost feels almost even lower key than the low-key respective plot that we saw, say, in Dr. No. Dr. No's plot is, I would say, arguably quite low-key, but this is even lower key than that, because we don't necessarily see any kind of super plot, super villain layer. Like, we see a layer, but it's more sort of Art Deco sort of layer rather than a super duper Ken Adam set with a rocket or something like that. And so my point is that even this plot is still very low-key, which is a difference from what we've seen even up to the most immediate, the film that we saw immediately prior, which is You Only Live Twice, which is so extravagant, so abundant with a lot of gadgets and large sets and everything like that. So this is almost like the polar opposite of what we've seen up to now. And also, there is, in a sense, a very cleanly laid out plot, right? The plot, I would suggest, is not necessarily that complicated. You have Blofeld and this idea of Virus Omega and his plot to try to sort of cause a threat which is based off of essentially biological warfare. And his goal is basically immunity, to get immunity and to have his title the Blofeld title recognized officially, and when he returns to private life, according to M, and something like that. But we never see any huge launch of a kind of plot to destroy the world. We never see anything of that sort. We always get a lot of talk, really. This is what virus Omega is. This is what my plan is. This, it will cause infertility, not just in a couple strains, but in an entire species, etc. And if my demands are not met, then I will, proceed with the systematic extinction of specifically targeted species around the world. Including the human race, and then Telly Savalas' Blofeld says, oh my dear Bond, I don't think the United Nations would let it get that far. I'm paraphrasing, of course, but that's essentially all that we get in terms of the plot. We get also the what are later referred to as the angels of death, right? Those girls, and their role in the plot in terms of their brainwashed and the use of the specific tools that they're given as Christmas gifts. Which we understand to be some kind of mind control mechanism, which is also used to maybe trigger whatever the chemical, the chemical virus is supposed to be triggered. So that sort of thing. So we get little elements of that, but we don't necessarily get the full fruition of that kind of follow through with these huge MacGuffin plots that we saw in previous Bond films like Thunderball or You Only Live Twice, etc. And also, the plot itself, I would argue, is not so complicated. We're not dealing necessarily with a plot that has a lot of complicated double cross and triple cross and pretending and acting and that sort of thing that we saw, say, in From Russia with Love. I think that plot is actually very complicated. This plot on Her Majesty's Secret Service is, I would argue, quite simple. Bond meets someone, he develops feelings for this someone, and he also gets information to try to find Blofeld. He finds Blofeld, he gets captured, he escapes, and he goes back and tries to get Blofeld and rescue his love and then save the day. That's essentially the plot, right? That is essentially the plot to this film. So there's no super duper overly expansive complication as far as the way that Spectre is expressed at all. I mean, Spectre is not even expressed in any sort of terms. We get little hints of it. We get the white cat, but there are aspects of that which are essentially thrown away. I mean, there's a very famous scene where Bond escapes on his skis, of course, and then the John Barry theme begins, dun, dun, and then what do we get? We get a call to Blofeld, and then it's, and then he gets the word that the Englishman has escaped. And what does Telly Savalas' Blofeld do? I mean, we've seen him with the cat once or twice, but what does he do? He essentially just throws the cat aside on the desk, and that is a very significant moment, right? Because up to now, all the Blofelds that we've seen, they've always had the cat and stroking the cat. Here, Telly Savalas' Blofeld is like, no, I'm putting the cat down and I'm standing on my own 2 feet. Not only that, I'm going to be the one who's going down on the skis. I'm not going to be sitting back letting everyone else do it. I'm going to be the one doing this. So we see a very different approach to Blofeld. We see a very different approach to M. We see a very different approach to the way that the plot develops and the sort of relative simplicity of the plot. We also see a difference in how the plot is arranged. Normally, we would see the sort of love interest grow as the film progresses. But here we get, I think, a very effective way that the film is arranged. Essentially, the film can be divided, I would say, into 3 parts. The first part, or maybe 4 parts, to be even more specific. The first part would be Bond meets Tracy and the development of that relationship leading up to the montage of We Have All the Time in the World, which is to indicate that they are indeed beginning to have significant and deep feelings for each other. Then the next part is essentially Bond trying to find and hunting down Blofeld and de Beauchamp, and so this is the whole scene with Gumboldt and his offices and breaking into the safe, meeting Sir Hilary Bray, and then going to Piz Gloria and then meeting Irma Bunt and then de Blofeld and the girls and all that stuff. And then there's another part which I could say is when Bond is discovered, and there's the revelation of the plot, and then the escape, and then the final showdown, and then the denouement of the film. So what is it actually? What did I say? I said 3 or 4, but in fact maybe that's 5 perhaps. But my point is that there are distinct sections of the film that I think can be made. And so, but what's interesting is that the love story actually happens in the first part. Essentially, it has it has a follow through towards the end of the film, of course, and around the maybe the 2/3 mark, when the two of them are alone, and Bond proposes marriage, and they essentially. In a sense, in a sort of almost spiritual way, they consummate their relationship, or sort of in a symbolic way, they consummate their relationship. Not only are they in love, but they are we see that they are compatible, both intellectually and also physically speaking, because we see that Tracy is very skilled in terms of driving, she's skilled in terms of skiing, she's very quick on her feet, she's very sharp, and this is exactly what I think Bond is looking for. And so, but my point is that the love story seems to be carried through at the very start of the film, and then that's left to have sort of its final strands at the end of the film, of course. But my point with all this is that this all feels like a different kind of Bond film, and I think that's what makes it very special for me in terms of its process and its emphasis and its push. And with that, let me now say that one of the things that I think is remarkable is just how much information is provided and how it echoes forth in terms of themes and little resonances and symbols that we see and carry through. And so therefore, I feel like this is a different Bond film, and it's also one that is filled with a lot of symbolism and a lot of structure and a lot of curiosity, with a lot of artistic panache, and also a great sense of style and verve. And so I really think that this is a special film. For example, and this is getting me back to Alan's comment, for example, let's take the opening sequence. And this is, again, let me just use this as an example of how I want to progress forward with this live stream. So the opening sequence is very, very significant for a lot of reasons. First, I think it shows us exactly how this film will be dealing with James Bond as a character. Now, if you recall, how is James Bond introduced in this particular film? We get word about James Bond. M talks about James Bond. Moneypenny is talking about James Bond. You know, M is saying we have to look for We have to look for 007. The Prime Minister is getting worried about Operation Bedlam. And then we hear the car, and we see the car driving in Europe. And then we hear the James Bond theme, the very famous James Bond theme, and we see little glimpses, the back of the head in silhouette, close-ups of the cigarette being lit, and the glasses being taken off as he notices Tracy driving alongside him and down the road. And we hear a little and then the music starts to go, and then the John Barry music really the heat is turned up, as it were, as the opening sequence progresses forward, and then Bond essentially pursues Tracy to the beach side, and sees what it is she is about to do. All these are done in close-up. All these are done in terms of interesting editing styles as well. So we understand, therefore, from the outset that James Bond as a character is almost, in a sense, being created before our very eyes. It is a cinematic construct, meaning that the whole concept of James Bond is being created in the editing, in the close-ups, in the whole mood and the music, everything layered in, the lighting, etc., the car that's being driven, and those little mannerisms. And so this reminds us, therefore, that James Bond is a cinematic creation. After all, we did see Sean Connery's James Bond introduced in a similar way in terms of how he was, there's close-ups to his hands, close-up to him opening the cigarette case, etc. When we first get introduced to him in Dr. No. So there's a similar kind of way in which he is introduced. In other words, James Bond is a cinematic construct, and so in that sense, as long as he is a cinematic construct, therefore, in any sense, any actor could, in essence, play him. Of course, I know it's not that simple, but my point is that it doesn't always have to be Sean Connery. And I find this to be very interesting and refreshing. And we see little glimpses of this as the film progresses. But my point is, at the start, James Bond is a cinematic construct. It is not Sean Connery. It is James Bond as a cinematic creation. I think that's very important. But what is so interesting is that we see George Lazenby, in essence, break free from the cinematic construct in kind of a really interesting way. We see him, the first time we see his face is when he realizes that Tracy is he wants to kill herself. And so he drives the car down to the beach close to the water, and he quickly gets out of the car, and that's the first time we see his face, and he runs over and tries to rescue Tracy, and then he rescues her, and then he says in a very sort of high-pitched voice, my name is Bond, James Bond. And then we get the fight between what we understand later to be two of Draco's men, and the fight on the beach there, which is very exciting, very intense. But I find that to be very interesting, in that the way that we see Bond break free from the James Bond construct of the editing and the dark glasses and the cigarette lighting and the music is when he is at the moment where he's wanting to rescue Tracy. And so I always thought that was so interesting. James Bond as a construct is a character that is very cold and very calculating and is on his mission. But here we see him for the first time essentially making contact or creating. This is the first time he is meeting Tracy. And Tracy is, I would argue, perhaps the most significant aspect of Bond, in the sense that he gets married. So in that sense, this is the most unusual kind of Bond trait. We have never seen Bond marry before. And so the fact that we see him break free, in a sense, from the way in which the James Bond character is being constructed, vis-a-vis, we see his face and we see him walking and running towards Tracy. I find that to be an interesting, almost subtle symbol, in the sense that this is almost like we see constructs of James Bond, but at the same time we see George Lazenby almost, in a sense, trying to break free and be his own James Bond, and we see him trying to do that. So we see a little bit of this in this opening sequence. The other thing that I think is significant about this opening sequence is that we see how foreground and background are used very effectively. And it's not just, I would argue, just in the sense of creating a pretty landscape or pretty mise-en-scène. I'm sure it's that too. But my point is that something is shown in the foreground and something is shown in the background at the same time. And this is a very clever trick of the camera, but we always see something in the foreground that will have some kind of significance or impact with the background. And we see there's a little bit of an interplay. It's not just a play on mise-en-scène. So what's an example? We see in the foreground and the background in one shot the fighting in the background, and then we see like it's a hook, or maybe it's an anchor or something with some curved hooks in the foreground, and the fighting is going on. And it's interesting because then that curved hook will be used momentarily afterwards as a weapon to be used against Bond. It's unsuccessful, but that's an example of something in the foreground that is related to something in the background, but the foreground will then be used and employed, or it will be thematically linked with something like that. So please look out for examples of the foreground-background connection that is both a thematic and visual connection. So we see an example of this in the opening sequence at the very outset. Some other examples we see of this, for instance, when Bond is fighting one of Draco's henchmen for the first time in the hotel room, we see the shots through the banister, right? And then moments later, we see that Bond throws the henchman through a similar looking set of banisters, and then he's laying there on the banisters, sort of knocked out. And he says, I'll leave you to clean up. And he's laying there among the white banisters. So it's almost like what we saw earlier with the shot through the banisters, almost foreshadowing how Bond will essentially take care of this particular henchman with vis-a-vis banisters that are similar looking, and he'll lay there, knocked out in essence. Another instance where the foreground and background are very important are where Bond has escaped Piz Gloria, but there's the avalanche, and Tracy has been apprehended and captured by Blofeld, and Bond is back in London. And there's a very famous shot where Bond is looking from the inside of the office outside through the window, and he is sort of almost in the background, and in the foreground is the window itself, and it's an interesting optical effect of the window showing Tracy's body being dragged out of the snow. It's almost serving as a kind of flashback that Bond is experiencing. So there's the foreground of the window reflection and the background of Bond standing there almost thinking about what it is we are seeing reflected on the window. It's a really beautiful optical effect. And so there's a foreground background connection, and I would say also probably most symbolically and most significantly, and perhaps most tragically, is the last shot of the film, or one of the last shots of the film, which is Tracy's death. And we see, right, this is probably the most significant foreground, background mise en scène that we see, and it's a very significant link. The foreground is, of course, the windshield with the bullet hole, and the background is we see Tracy with having been fatally wounded, and then her body slumping to the side. And so that is, I think, the most significant foreground background shot. So up to throughout the film, we've seen foreground background shots of things in the foreground connected with things in the background, and there's an interplay, there's a thematic connection, and ultimately there's a sort of visual connection that I think culminates most strikingly and most effectively and most tragically in this final image of the foreground of the bullet hole through the windscreen, and the body of the now lifeless Tracy, who then slumps to the side. So my point is that we see this use of mise en scène operating at the very outset during this opening sequence, which I think is fantastic. Another thing that we see in this opening sequence is foreshadowing. And I think this idea of foreshadowing, echoing forward, is very, very significant, and I'll try to get to that in a second. But what's the ultimate foreshadowing here? The ultimate foreshadowing here in this opening sequence is, of course, the idea that Tracy, during this scene, is, we understand, in a very difficult emotional state. For whatever reason, she's in a very difficult emotional state, such that we're not sure if she really means it, but probably she does. We see that she is trying to essentially commit suicide. And so this is a very significant thing, very, very drastic situation. And this is where Bond comes and tries to rescue her from doing what it is that she seems to be wanting to try to do to herself. But this is also quite a significant moment too, because how does Bond look at her for the first time, if you recall? He looks at her through the sight of a gun, right? And so we see her close up and her face as she's walking towards the sea, and we see her through the sight of a gun. And I find that to be a very chilling image, because this is, of course, I think, foreshadowing to what will eventually happen to Tracy, right? How will she unfortunately die? She will die with a bullet, which is a very, very terrible way, a very, very tragic way. But we see this foreshadowed, I think, almost quite chillingly in these opening moments. And I think also that's very significant too, because we will see other instances where foreshadowing occurs quite chillingly, and also very maybe imperceptibly, excuse me. And we'll see how these things echo and repeat each other going forward. And so I'll try to talk a little bit about that. And I would say finally, we see George Lazenby and how he is depicted as James Bond in this opening sequence. And there is a sense of him trying to maybe I mean, there's some lines where I think he doesn't. It's a little bit maybe overplayed in terms of his first line. My name is Bond, James Bond. I always found that to be a little bit maybe too high pitched or something like that. But I never found it necessarily to be overly annoying because he followed through, I think, with a much more subtly delivered line that closes the opening scene, which is "This never happened to the other fella," and he turns and looks to the camera, and then we start off on our way with the title sequence. And so I think my point is that we will see also throughout this film George Lazenby's performance. Maybe there are some moments where it might seem a little bit off, but there are other moments which I think he balances it very well, or his performance is well balanced to the point where I think we don't get a totally off performance. We get something that there might arguably be a few iffy moments here and there, but I don't think they're particularly significantly adverse to his performance. And I think they're further helped by the fact that there are other moments that are very strong that help to balance out those sort of iffy moments, as it were. And so these are kind of examples of what I think that the opening sequence is, other than, of course, being a very thrilling, exciting fight among Bond and a couple of henchmen. We see also some echoes going forward, which I think are going to be very interesting. The henchmen, if you recall, one of them puts a knife to the throat of Tracy, which I always thought to be a very weird thing, right? Because if one of the henchmen, if they're working for Draco, that's essentially meaning that they are basically putting a knife to the daughter of their boss. And so I don't know about you, but if my boss asked me to do something like this, the last thing I'd want to do is put a knife to my boss's daughter's throat or anything like that, lest I get fired or even worse or something like that. But this is an indication also of how women are treated, in particular how Tracy is treated, both in particular physically. There are moments where she's treated quite horribly by the men in this film, Bond and Draco in particular. But I think there is a kind of maybe narrative explanation as to why those moments of violence against Tracy do occur. They are a little bit uncomfortable, and so I think they're certainly worth mentioning. They should be mentioned, and so I'll try to mention those later. Also, we see a little glimpse of Tracy and her driving, right? Because Tracy we understand to be a very skilled driver. We understand later she will be a very skilled skier, and so we see a little glimpse of her driving, right? She handles the car very well on the little dune there of sand, and so this is a little bit of a I don't know if we'd call it a Chekhov's gun yet, but this is a little indication of how well she can handle herself in a car, and this will of course come up later, maybe in the second half of the film. But this is an indication, so it's nice to get that little hint right now. Also, I'm so sorry. Just one other thing about Tracy and Bond, and I'll get to the comments. But another thing that we see in this opening sequence, which is very, very significant, symbolism. Okay, always remember how Bond and Tracy they're seated. Tracy is sitting, for instance, in the cars they're driving. Bond is driving a car with the steering wheel on the right-hand side. Tracy's driving a car, the red car, with the steering wheel on the left-hand side. So in essence, Bond is always sitting on the right, or if we're looking towards them, he would be sitting on screen left, right? He would always be sitting on screen left. Tracy will always be sitting on screen right. And that's an interesting little dynamic. So Bond will always be on the left side of the screen, and then Tracy will always be on the right side of the screen if they're facing each other. We see this in their separate cars and when they're driving. We will see it whenever they're sitting in cars. We will see it when they are in the barn in the middle there, when they're sleeping next to each other. Bond is on the floor and Tracy's on the little cart there. So Bond is on the left, Tracy's on the right. When Tracy is driving, when they're in the car, the red car, and they're trying to escape Irma Bunt and Blofeld's men. She's driving, so she's on the right, Bond is on the left. When they're driving to Gumbold's office, she's on the right, he is on the left. And of course, when they're driving at the very end, right, she is on the right, he is on the left. And so there's a little bit of a kind of a physical space echo, if you will, which I think is actually quite chilling the more I think about it. There was another thing I wanted to mention, but I think that's it for now. Oh yes, the other thing I wanted to mention, and I'll get to the chat here, is again how this opening credit sequence is significant. Also note that this is also something that we see in terms of Tracy and nighttime, but we will see daytime, and how daytime and the scenes of her in daytime, I think, are rather infrequent versus the scenes that we see of Tracy in nighttime. And I think this is very significant. What is the relationship, or what is the sort of symbolic, thematic significance in terms of Tracy and the nighttime versus Tracy and the daytime? And we also should remember how the daytime and the sun, how this is also treated in this film. I think it's, I'm not sure if it's done on purpose, but there are very strong thematic links between the sun, nighttime in Tracy, and sun and daylight in Blofeld. And so I'd like to try to get into that later in this live chat if I have the opportunity. But that's just a sort of an opening salvo in terms of how I view this film and the significance of the opening sequence, or the pre-credit sequence, together with the fact that I think it's a very thrilling way to open the film. But anyway, Alan, thank you very much for that great comment to start. I really appreciate it. And just going through here, Dinobot Q is giving us a great overview of his view of the James Bond series, which is great. Zyrother says, I like the lack of gadgets and fancy tech. Nice change of pace. It follows the source novel very closely. Hulkeract is here. Hello. Let's see. Wolfgrat says, I actually thought Lazenby wasn't that bad in the serious bits. It's the comedic sides that didn't go well. Death is easy. Comedy is hard. Randy Palace, is Sean Connery in that movie? Let's see. It's just scrolling down. Tomahawk 3238 says, I've always thought Telly Savalas' depiction of Blofeld would have been the perfect Lex Luthor. Oh, that's interesting. That's interesting. Yeah, he does have a certain almost cosmopolitan air about him. I think Telly Savalas' Blofeld is one of the most interesting aspects of this film. Yeah, really, really interesting. He and Irma Bunt, what a combination. Wow, that is such a combination. Let's see here. I'm just scrolling down here. Sorry for skipping over some comments. Cooper Glover, 1972 says, I remember Lazenby was just cast from a commercial and just going into Harry Saltzman's office. And yeah, so that's a recollection that George Lazenby actually gives in one of the making of documentaries, or the making of documentary that was first made for this particular DVD release. Leprechaun says, did you, Daisuke, like George Lazenby as James Bond? Yes, I do. I think his James Bond needed another film. It certainly needed another film. Actually, that's a good Leprechaun. Great. This is great. So I'll use Leprechaun's comment and just talk about one of the things I wanted to talk about, which is George Lazenby. This is the big aspect of this film, which I think is probably the most controversial aspect, in the sense that maybe some people really like what he did. Others probably think he's the weakest part of the film, or his performance is the weakest part of the film, and all that. There's some comments about how his comedy bits might seem a little bit off. There was some post-dubbing done for most of the bits, and so you could tell that there's a little bit of a separate divide between the action on screen and the post-synced dubbed dialogue that was recorded over that. And so I think that has a lot to do with a little bit of separation that one naturally feels between what one sees and what one hears. And that's especially true with some of the dialogue that is definitely looped over. When after he beats up the henchman in the hotel room early on, he gets a little thing of the caviar, and he says, we don't even see him talk, we just see him and his back turned to the camera, and you can tell it was sort of looped in, which is, what is it, Royal Beluga, north of the Caspian, that sort of thing. And other things like that is like, when he's apprehended, just about as he's about ready to go to golf, he says, why not, we can make it a foursome or something. And there's some little sides, maybe towards the end of the film there, guns make me nervous, and which I understand is actually George Baker doing the looping there. But my point is that I do think, yes, there are some iffy moments in terms of the line delivery of some of the comedic lines. But I think also that there are some really good moments of him delivering sort of the dramatic set pieces of the film, I think, as Wolfgratz was suggesting there. Also, this is another way for me to look at it. George Lazenby's James Bond feels like a younger James Bond. He feels like maybe he's very smart. He knows his expertise apparently extends to lepidoptery, which is interesting. He reads up on heraldry in his spare time apparently, and so he's obviously a very sharp intellect, and he knows what he's doing, and he's very quick on his feet. But he does seem to be very young. He seems to be younger than the Connery Bond that we saw before, which is perhaps suggestive to be, and I think this is maybe on purpose, it's almost suggestive to be a kind of maybe immaturity on Bond's part. I know that's not maybe directly what's trying to be depicted here, but I think there is a sense of this being kind of the immature young Bond, if you will. And I think this is due to George Lazenby and his physical look as well as his performance. He has a certain arrogance to him, the Bond that he's portraying. He's a kind of know-it-all, and he's not afraid to show it, which I think is maybe a good thing. It shows that he has a kind of an intellect, but also maybe a not so good thing because it does turn people off to his character. But I think that it works to a kind of advantage, because that kind of immature Bond, if we want to put it that way, is almost the perfect way to start an arc that starts with Bond in this immature way and then ends up in a very meaningful relationship with Tracy at the end, which I think is and you can see that he is, right, what does he say? Thank you, but this time I've got the gadgets and I know how to use them, which is, I think, one way to interpret that line is that he's grown up. And so, but what happens at the point that he grows up? His world is destroyed, potentially forever. And so there is a certain tragedy in that arc, if you think about it. A young, almost immature young man who is very adept and very skilled and knows how to handle himself, meets someone who apparently gives him a sense of emotional fulfillment. And then he transforms. I mean, the scenes that he has with Tracy, you can tell that he is more, how shall I put it? He doesn't seem to be the arrogant Bond that we see in other parts of the film, but rather he seems to be more a calmer, more at peace sort of Bond. And this is exemplified so perfectly, I think, in the scene between Bond and Tracy in the barn, just after they've escaped from Pisglory, or he's escaped from Pisglory, and they've escaped from the henchmen in the town, and the snow is starting to fall rather heavily. But there's a moment where they're just looking at each other, and then the John Barry rendition of "We Have All the Time in the World" kicks in very softly, very gently, and then it goes into that lovely bit where they're talking, and they're talking, the two of them, and Bond is on the floor and Tracy's just above him, and he says, "Will you marry me?" And she says, "Do you mean it?" And so that, I think, really gives us a sense of a different kind of Bond, a Bond who is not or no longer immature, and that leads us through to the remainder of the film, in a sense, only to have his world, as I say, be shattered forever at the hands of Erebund and Ernst Stavro Blofeld, of course. But so my point is that George Lazenby's performance, I think, could be seen to be, in effect, a kind of way to establish a sort of arc within the film itself, from an immature Bond to a Bond who finds love and emotional fulfillment, only to have that taken away from him at the most terrible, terrible time. And I find that arc, therefore, to be quite dramatically effective. And so, therefore, that dramatic effect of that arc is dependent on an arrogant, immature Bond from the outset. And so, with that, I can go along with these little asides that kind of are a little bit iffy or a little bit cringy, you know, Royal Beluga, North of the Caspian, and that sort of thing. I can go along with that. And I can get a sense of that because I know I can understand that maybe this works well in the context of a dramatic arc that we see. And really, he delivers the goods, especially by the end. And that last scene is emotionally quite harrowing. And he does an excellent job with that. And so I think, therefore, you know, he's not meant to be dramatic all the way through. I mean, he's meant to be lighthearted. You know, what does he say to Draco at the early part of the film? You know, he has a bachelor's taste for freedom. And so that, I think, is indicative or symbolic of the fact that he is very much, you know, he enjoys his freedom, and that maybe means that maybe he's a little bit immature, or maybe he doesn't know when to keep his mouth shut or anything like that. But that also is indicative of the fact that he's very, of course, he's Bond and he knows how to handle himself, he knows how to get out of a situation. But also he grows, but that growth leads to the ultimate, really tragic climax of the film. And so in that sense, I can get George Lazenby's performance and I can go with it. And I find, therefore, this to be a really great, consistent Bond, one that it fits very well with the arc of the character that we see in this film. Also, if we recall, or if we think that the death of Tracy is in many ways perhaps the most significant emotional aspect of the cinematic representation of James Bond in the Eon, the Broccoli Saltzman produced films. Up to now, we haven't had such a terrible, tragic, shocking moment. This is probably the most shocking moment in the entire film series up to now. Sure, we've had some really sad moments in some of the other films. Sure, I get it. I felt sad as well, but this is probably the saddest moment, the most shocking moment. And the fact that this is and this will also have ramifications, as some of you may know, in later films. We'll see little glimpses here and there of how this affects Bond, the cinematic depiction of Bond. We'll see it in The Spy Who Loved Me, we'll see it in For Your Eyes Only, we'll see it in we'll even see it in License to Kill and that sort of thing. In other words, we'll see a kind of ripple effect that this moment has. And so we understand this moment to be probably the most a significantly tragic moment in the cinematic Bond life. And that means that this moment is in itself a kind of in a way, a dramatic anomaly. And the fact that it's a dramatic anomaly makes this particular film and George Lazenby, the fact that it's his only performance and its only film, it gives it also a kind of symbolic anomaly sense, right? Because it's the only George Lazenby film. It's sort of, oh, it's the one that's not with Connery, that sort of thing. But it helps to set it aside and make it, I think, extra special, because it therefore gives it that aura of being separate from the rest. But it's also separate, I think, for a very good reason. The fact that it's probably the most tragic, shocking moment within any of the films up to now. So I actually think the presence of George Lazenby and the fact that it's just a one-off actually adds to the aura of this particular moment as it has grown in stature as the series has progressed. This is to say also that I think George Lazenby, in terms of I think he should have done another one. It would have been better for him to show us a second film. I think, I mean, one of the things I really like about, and I won't get into too many details, but one of the things I really like about Casino Royale and Quantum of Solace, the Daniel Craig films, is that we actually get a kind of arc and a kind of a follow-through with that, which I think was probably what the design, or that was kind of in spirit what the design could have been in terms of a George Lazenby On Her Majesty's Secret Service and a George Lazenby Diamonds Are Forever. I mean, that could have been the arc And I think we could have seen something of how that arc could have played out in the later films from Daniel Craig, Casino Royale and Quantum of Solace. I'm not saying that they're exactly the same, but my point is that there is a sort of a dramatic shift in terms of going from one film to the next. And so I think the fact that we saw, as I say, an immature Bond, I'm using air quotes because I know it's not quite that way, but my point is that it was a little bit of a lighthearted, younger feeling sort of Bond, who might have not necessarily been, a younger Bond who had his iffy moments. So we saw that on Her Majesty's Secret Service. It would have been really, I think, dramatically apropos, therefore, to have seen a more dramatic, destroyed Bond in Diamonds Are Forever, and then have a real hunt, a real just no-holds-barred hunt. Not the sort of thing that you see in the first few minutes of what actually happened in the actual film Diamonds Are Forever, but something that is really just hard-edged. And so that's, I mean, that in that sort of way, I always thought that License to Kill was in many ways a sort of spiritual sequel, if you will, to On Her Majesty's Secret Service. I mean, it's not quite the same, I understand, but there are similar plot threads. If you know that film, you know what I'm talking about. But it would have been interesting to see what George Lazenby would have done with another film. But be that as it may, I do think that even with this, his only performance, and even with those sort of questionable aspects of his performance here and there, it is overall, I think, really good and symbolically significant and important, and it has an interesting effect on the overall series and trajectory of the film series as a whole, making it a one-off, making it stand on its own, and therefore giving it its own aura, which is heightened even further by the fact that this includes one of the most shocking moment in the cinematic story of James Bond thus far. So that's my take on George Lazenby. So I think he's very good in this. I think he's really good in this. There are moments, though, where I think he is. This is one of the interesting things about the film, though, is that it is trying to do two things at once, right? It is trying to be like its own Bond film, but it's also trying to essentially milk off of the success of Sean Connery's James Bond, right? And it was trying to create a successful transition of a new Bond, but still it was the same Bond, right? And so that's why we see all these links to the past Bond films. We see all the links to all the films, Dr. No up to You Only Live Twice, in the opening title sequence. We see that little scene in the early on where he's in his office and he pulls out the Honey Rider's knife, and we hear the music as he does, and he pulls out the watch. I mean, I'm not going to talk too much about From Russia with Love, but how did he get that watch? I don't know. I don't remember him getting that watch. Maybe he got off the train and then he did all of a sudden, and he actually went back on. I don't know, but he got, and then he's got the breather as well. They're all Terence Young films, by the way. There are no Guy Hamilton or Lewis Gilbert films, but they're all Terence Young films, which I think is also very significant. I think that's also just suggestive of the fact that Peter Hunt has a very clear trajectory between his Bond and the Bond of Terence Young, rather than Guy Hamilton's Bond or Lewis Gilbert's Bond. But the point is that there are moments where the film is trying so hard to connect with Connery, but at the same time, we have to remember this: George Lazenby is not Sean Connery. He is not Sean Connery. He doesn't sound like Sean Connery. He doesn't look like Sean Connery. He might have a similar hairstyle as Sean Connery, but he doesn't have the same build. It's not the same. But it doesn't have to be the same, because as I was suggesting before, the fact that he's not Sean Connery means that we can look at him as being a sort of different, younger, more immature Bond, which I think works dramatically in terms of the arc that we see Bond go throughout this film. Okay, and then also, I think any sort of direct links with Sean Connery in this film, I think actually, to be perfectly honest, work to the disadvantage of the film, because they just serve to remind us that Sean Connery isn't in the film. And so when we see these little things about, I mean, I think, to be perfectly honest, I think that whole scene with the knife, recalling Dr. No and From Russia with Love, and Thunderball. I think that's one of the weaker parts of the film, to be perfectly honest. I think it would have been better, much better, to sort of cut that stuff out. I mean, I understand the whole point of it. I think the producers were nervous. People, the powers that be, were probably nervous. They were going with an unknown, and they needed to have some kind of thematic link. They needed to reassure the audience that this was the same character. There was a kind of through line, and therefore they were establishing a sort of a continuity between what happened all the way up to You Only Live Twice and Sean Connery's Bond, and the Bond of now, which is George Lazenby. So, but even so, those attempts at continuity don't work either. And I think they work to the disadvantage of the film. And I think that the film would have worked much better without those attempts at creating continuity with past Bond films. Not only because it reminds us that Sean Connery isn't in this film, but also the continuity doesn't work. It doesn't work, right? Because if we establish the continuity, that means that this is the same James Bond that just finished his assignment in You Only Live Twice, right? And so if we go from You Only Live Twice to On Her Majesty's Secret Service, we understand, therefore, that there is a huge plot hole. It doesn't make sense. What doesn't make sense? Bond and Blofeld should know each other. They should be able to recognize each other face to face. But the fact that they don't necessarily, it seems, they don't acknowledge each other when they first are face to face at Piz Gloria is one of the big, I mean, I'm not the first one to mention this, but this is one of the big plot holes. How could they not necessarily recognize each other? They probably did or something, I don't know, but the point is that they don't recognize each other immediately. Of course, they're being played by different actors, of course, but if the continuity is the same, then this scene doesn't make sense at all. So my point is that any attempts to establish continuity, I think, work to the film's disadvantage inherently. I think it works much better as a kind of vague, faint, ambiguous thing. Just leave it at that. But even so, I still get what they were trying to do. And even with that sense, I do think that, as I was trying to suggest earlier, there are ways in which this film is trying to build up George Lazenby as Connery, or as a Connery type of Bond. But at the same time, they're trying to build him up as a cinematic construct of Bond, not necessarily as a Connery Bond, and I really appreciate that. And then even with that, there are moments where George Lazenby seems to be breaking free of that, and he's trying to sort of forge his own path. I think done most effectively in the final scene in the car, when he is so destroyed after the death of Tracy. That's not the cinematic construct of James Bond. That's just a camera just on George Lazenby and just holding on him for whatever it is, a minute or so, and then he cries and then the film's over. That's not a cinematic construct. That's all George Lazenby. So in a sense, that's him breaking free from all the ways in which the film up to now has been trying to cinematically construct him up into the character of James Bond, using the close-ups. There's also zooms. I don't know if you notice this, the way that the film uses zooms. It uses a quick zoom at the very opening credits, or the pre-opening, when Bond is running into the sea, trying to save Tracy. Remember that? It's just a random zoom out, which is, I think, it's like connecting us with, connecting our perception of Bond as a cinematic character with the idea of zooms. We'll see also zooms being used when Bond is fighting the henchman just before he meets Draco for the first time. Remember, just outside his office, he's fighting all the henchmen, and the zooms out and all this stuff in a very exciting, closed, sort of claustrophobic fight. And then we see the interesting use of zooms later when Bond is knocked out at Piz Gloria, and he wakes up and he says, Blofeld says, "Merry Christmas, 007." And we realize that his cover has been blown, and it's those zooms out into the top of the Christmas tree and all that. So that's an interesting way of the zooms at that moment, in a sense, destroying his cover and really establishing him as 007, which is in effect suggesting or tying the use of zooms with the cinematic construct of 007. Indeed, at that moment, he is being constructed as 007 because Blofeld recognizes him as 007. So the zooms are a sort of cinematic way, or cinematic tool to cinematically construct James Bond as a cinematic character. But there are then moments where George Lazenby, it's just him and the camera. And as I say, the final shot, the final shot with him anyway, is just him and the camera. And so that, I would suggest, is George Lazenby essentially trying to break free. So there, I think, I'm maybe speaking too much about this, so I'll end it here on that point. But I think there's a lot to say about George Lazenby and his performance as Sean, it's not Sean Connery, but that reminds me of a Simpsons joke, right? That's a rare picture of Sean Connery as signed by Roger Moore, or did I get it the other way around? But anyway, yes. So my point is that the aspect of George Lazenby's performance, I think, is actually, it works much better the more I think about it, and it serves the film really well, and it serves the whole franchise really well. And so, even within the film, I think his choices are really good choices. And so I would have loved to have seen him in another film. I would love to have seen George Lazenby's Diamonds Are Forever, but oh well, we got a different Diamonds Are Forever. But I'll have some comments about that if and when we get to that one. But let's see. So, all right. So I'll thank you very much, Leprechaun. And just moving forward, just scrolling down here with the Mainly Movie says, I've always thought that Lazenby brought a more emotional, real feeling quality to Bond, especially after Connery in You Only Live Twice. Yes, yes, yes. And indeed, that scene at the end is proof positive of that, my friend. You're absolutely right. Let's see. And also, I should say, and Zyrother says this, right after production ended, Lazenby announced he would not do another. So even before the premiere, Saltzman and Broccoli were not pleased with Lazenby. Yes, so there's a lot of behind-the-scenes stuff. There's a lot of behind-the-scenes kind of shenanigans that is documented in a number of places. You can see a little bit in the Everything or Nothing documentary. You can see a little bit of it here in the MGM or the DVD documentary, which is now on the Blu-ray release as well. So you can see a lot of stuff about how George Lazenby probably wasn't the easiest actor to work with. And I know I've seen a documentary or an interview later where Diana Riggs echoed something very similar about that. And so there's that. So there are all these stories, of course, but those are, one can listen to those behind the scenes or background information stories, and then that can affect your viewing of this film. I think that's fair. That's very reasonable. But you don't necessarily have to have it affect your viewing. You can if you want to, and I think that's perfectly within your purview and choice as a viewer and as a consumer of these goods, because you are paying money to buy these films and to watch the Blu-rays and all that. But for me, I never really took it to heart. In other words, I know the stories. I've heard the stories about how he was a difficult actor to work with, but I don't think that necessarily affects the way I view his performance. And I still think what we have on screen is still quite spectacular for the reasons that I was trying to cite. So, but anyway, thank you very much, my friends. Thank you. Let's see. Rachel, the Music Man VC, it's nice to see you, my dear friend. Nice to see you. Alan says, I'm a big... Whoops. Oh, I just skipped it. All right, let me just go back. Sorry about this. Go back to that comment. Alan was talking about Blofeld, and let's see, where is it? Okay, sorry about this. Oh, it's such a good comment too. Okay, sorry about this. Sorry about that. Just give me one moment. I think Alan's... okay, here we go. Alan says, I'm a big fan of Telly Savalas' performance as Blofeld. It was quite good. Less of the maniacal Blofeld in some regards. Yes, I agree. Now let me talk about this one here too. This is another one of the differences that I was trying to cite earlier as to why I think this is significantly different or set off from the rest of the Bond films up to now. Telly Savalas' Blofeld. This is a really wonderful, quirky, a lot of quirky choices in terms of the way he plays it. Now, first of all, this is not the Blofeld, or not, I should take that back. This is not the same characterization of Blofeld that we have seen up to now in the prior Connery films. We have always seen Blofeld pretty much sitting down, sedentary, usually with the cat, maybe he'll run around a bit, but he doesn't seem necessarily to be a very physical threat to Bond, at least to Connery's Bond. Here, for the first time, we get a sense that Telly Savalas's Blofeld is a Blofeld that walks around, that has maybe a science background. He knows how to construct virus Omega, and he has the cat, right? But again, as I point out, it's very, very symbolic and important. The fact that when Bond escapes and he gets the phone call, Blofeld gets the phone call, what does he do? He puts the cat down. And that is such an important moment. That's like almost saying to us, the audience, this is not the cat holding Blofeld that we're talking about here. This is a Blofeld who can ski, who can drive even when his neck is in a brace and all that stuff. So he's physical. He's a physical Bond. I mean, and he doesn't get phased, right? Remember the moment when Bond is about to be thrown into essentially the cell, which is essentially the back of the Piz Gloria, where the huge, I don't know what, I forget the word, but this is where the cable car is the gears of the cable car, I suppose, and we see Bond trying to escape. But remember Blofeld, even when Bond is almost subduing the two guards, Blofeld's just standing there by the door, so calm. It's like he's not phased at all. And so I think this is a sense that this is a Blofeld that can hold his own, both physically and intellectually, against Bond, which I think is wonderful. And again, the cat being essentially thrown on the desk there with a wonderful growl as well. I think that's very symbolic. It's saying this is not the Blofeld that holds the cat anymore. This is the Blofeld that will ski and will just be relentless. I mean, he must have been skiing for goodness knows how long before he's trying to catch up with Bond and eventually Tracy, of course. And it's also a very smart Blofeld. He's a strategic Blofeld, right? Because we see him thinking, right? We see him thinking, what is it? I love the moment when Sir Hilary Bray, right? Bond posing as Sir Hilary Bray, makes that slip up about Augsburg, right? Which wasn't really a slip up, right? Because actually the real Sir Hilary Bray actually mentioned Augsburg, right? He didn't mention what is it, St. Anne Kirsch, but he mentioned Augsburg. So in fact, the real Sir Hilary Bray made the same mistake. So I'd like to think that even if the real Sir Hilary Bray went to Piz Gloria and made that same mistake about mentioning Augsburg and the Beauchamp tombs, I'd like to think that maybe Sir Hilary Bray wouldn't have made it out of Piz Gloria alive either. But anyway, that's a completely different story. But what was I saying? So yes, so I love the moment when Telly Savalas's Blofeld gives that look of Augsburg, right? You know that that's the moment where Bond's cover has been blown. I love that. And from then on, you just see Blofeld just slowly turning on the pressure, not making Bond leave, giving any excuse he can to make Bond stay, and it goes downhill from there. Literally, it goes downhill from there for Bond. And so I really love those moments. He's a thinking Blofeld. Even when he's skiing, he has the good mind to stop, and he says flare, and he lights it, and he says, you know, and what is one of his henchmen says, you know, he's making for the village, and what is he? All right, we'll head him off at the precipice. That's a great moment too, because we know that he is thinking almost three-dimensionally. He's trying to catch up with Bond, and so he says, you know, he thinks of the strategy on the spot. We'll head him off on the precipice. That's a very interesting foreshadowing line too that he says, right? Because not only does he try to head him off at the precipice during the ski fight, but right, he actually confronts Bond at a precipice later in the film, at the very end of the film, right, when Bond and Tracy stop on the cliffside on the road there, right? I mean, essentially, he indeed headed him off at the precipice in a certain way. So that's an interesting foreshadowing. I don't know if that was really intended, but that is another foreshadowing that we see. We also see Blofeld thinking in terms of, he knows he can't necessarily catch up with Bond and Tracy, so what does he do? He sees that he has his chance with igniting the sound that will cause the avalanche to occur, and so that is a very brutal thinking Blofeld, which is really wonderful. Going back to our discussion of George Lazenby's Bond and then Blofeld, another interesting moment with Blofeld that I always thought was so fascinating was in the bobsled chase at the very end, if you recall. There's a moment where Bond is pursuing Blofeld, of course, because Blofeld is trying to get away. And there's a moment where Blofeld is thinking about counterattacking by throwing a grenade, right? And so, and he's got the pin, and it drops. Remember, and that's when the whole kind of weird, almost psychedelic sounding John Barry like music kicks in. It's also hyper realized suspense music, right? Which I always thought was so fascinating. You know, why would the suspense music kick in with Blofeld when the grenade is on the floor and he's struggling to pick it up? I always thought that was such almost like like a Hitchcockian textbook example of Hitchcockian suspense. Even with the villain, the suspense is applied to the film such that we are in that particular moment, we're kind of on edge, hoping that he'll make it out of this particular situation. Really, we do. And so, and this is the bad guy of the film. And so I always thought that that was an interesting moment. It also lends credence to the fact that maybe, you know, for those who might think George Lazenby wasn't necessarily the most likable Bond in his portrayal, I always thought that this was almost, in a way, a kind of maybe unintentional wink to that part of the audience, saying that, oh yes, you know, we'll have your sympathies with this Telly Savalas Blofeld, even if it's for a little bit, in terms of the suspense sequence and the little grenade that's on the floor there for a little bit. He manages to throw it just in the nick of time, of course, but I always thought that that was very interesting. It was like an interesting thing. Also, there are little quirky choices that he does, you know, the way he holds his cigarette, which I always thought was kind of weird and creepy, and it was an interesting touch. And when he goes, you know, what, you know, and you know, you'll help me convince the authorities that I do what I say, or that I that I mean what I say, and that I'll do what I claim. And he holds a cigarette like this, and it's almost oddly threatening in a very indirect way. I don't know, I can't quite describe it, but the way he holds it, and he doesn't hold it like a cigarette holder. He takes a little, he inhales, but he inhales almost like on the very tip. It's not like he's putting the entire cigarette, part of that cigarette in his mouth, but he's doing that little thing just at the very tip. And so I always found it to be a very interesting way of smoking a cigarette. I thought it was a little quirky choice, but I thought it worked very well with Blofeld. And one other very significant thing about Telly Savalas' Blofeld in this film, which I think is really, really significant, is the way that Peter Hunt, the director, Peter Hunt, connects his Blofeld with the idea of sunlight and sunshine. Did you notice this? I always thought this was really interesting. Remember when one of Draco's men, now Bond's ally, he's trying to hike up his Gloria, and he's trying to sort of stake out the place. And he's you see a shot of Blofeld from up on high, and the sun is blaring from right behind him. And he says, oh, this is private property. And of course, we understand that later. We understand that this ally of Bond will end up being killed in a very horrifying way, held upside down and frozen to death, we assume. But we see the shot of Blofeld with the sunshine blaring from behind him, almost in silhouette. It's a really oddly artistic shot. Very effective, very out of place. We've never seen the striking use of light in the film up to now before. But I always thought that was interesting. Why do we have this moment of sunlight and Blofeld in this particular shot? And never thought much of it until much later. And do you remember where we see another shot of Blofeld and kind of sunlight or sunshine or sort of bright light? Do you remember another shot like that? It was a shot where, after Bond just has escaped from Piz Gloria on skis and the whole exciting chase down the mountain, we see Blofeld, of course, running up and getting ready to go out, and then we see a shot of Bond skiing down the slopes again. And suddenly we get a random shot of a sunlight or shining light or something, and it fades quickly to Blofeld coming out of the doors and then him skiing down with some other henchmen. I always thought that was so strange and out of place, except that it's almost like a subliminal. I mean, I understand it's like a jump cut in a way, and it's supposed to jog us out. It's supposed to give us more energy, and it's kind of an editing trick. You know, Peter Hunt was also an editor as well as being the director of this film. He edited many of the films of the Bond series up to this film, and so we understand that he employs a lot of editing tricks. Or he allows a lot of editing tricks, and I think this is on Her Majesty's Secret Service is filled with a lot of these editing tricks. But the fact that Blofeld is associated not once but twice visually with what can be described as being kind of sunlight or sunshine, I think is very, very significant actually. And the more I think about it, the more I realize that Blofeld is in fact connected visually with sunlight and sunrise and the dawn, right? Not only in these two shots, but also remember how Tracy is trying to deflect or trying to distract Blofeld and get his attention away elsewhere in order for him to be distracted so that Bond and Draco can make their attack via helicopter on Piz Gloria. And so how does Tracy do this? She recites the James Elroy Flecker poem, right? Thy dawn, O master of the world, thy dawn, right? So thy dawn, right? Dawn is linked to sunshine and sunrise, of course. But what is it? But thy dawn, O master of the world, thy dawn, for thee the sunlight creeps across the lawn. So the sunlight and dawn are now linked not just visually in these two shots, but also like poetically in the dialogue that Tracy gives to Blofeld. And I think even early in that dialogue session between Blofeld and Tracy, there Blofeld makes mention of all the world's riches of Paris, right? Just so he could look at the dawn with in the arms of his beloved Helen. And so there's this notion of dawn, sunlight, that is made reference to in the poetic, in the poetry that is in the dialogue between Tracy and Blofeld. But also there's something of a sinister, chilling aspect to the use of sunshine in this film. Recall what I was trying to say earlier about Tracy and the fact that we never really see her. We see her in some moments in the film where there's sunlight. But for a lot of the time we see her when it's dark and when it's nighttime. The the pre-title sequence is, I think, whatever it is, late night or early morning, so that's not quite daylight yet. We see a little bit of something maybe in the far distance in the sky, but it's pretty much nighttime. We see her later in the casino, and that's also nighttime. And then they have Bond and Tracy have their night together in the bed, which was also, I thought, a very interesting thing. They have the bed, which is outside on the balcony. And I always thought if one had a kind of maybe a romantic night with another person in bed, I always thought that the best place to do it wouldn't be in a bed outside where one could probably hear everything that was going on, but rather have it be indoors, so you didn't have to worry about other people listening in on what it is you and your companion were doing in bed. But anyway, that's a completely different story. But what was I saying? So yes, so Tracy in that moment is seen at night, but when it's morning, she's gone, right? We see her at daytime at certain significant scenes, but those are always with her father, right? We see her daytime at her father's birthday, and then we see her in the car with her father and Bond as they're driving to Gumbold's office later, and then we see her at her wedding, which is also in the sunlight and the sunshine. So in those key moments, we see her in the sunshine. But in most of the other, and also we see her skiing down with Bond as well. So that's maybe an exception to what it is I'm about to say. So it's not a perfect, analysis of what I'm about to say. But what I was trying to say was, for the most part, we see Tracy in nighttime scenes. When we see her in daytime scenes, again, for the most part, she is usually with her father. When she is not with her father during the daytime scenes, she is with Bond. And when she is with Bond, she is under threat from Blofeld, right? This is really weird. And this is so weird that Blofeld comes to threaten both Bond and Tracy Blofeld threatens Tracy whenever Tracy is in a scene where there's sunshine or sun or daytime, which is culminating, of course, at the very end where Tracy is killed by Blofeld and Irma Bunt. When is it? Is it at nighttime? No, it is during the day. And so Blofeld connected with the sunshine in these two shots, with James Elwer Flecker's poem, Thy Dawn, O Master of the World, Thy Dawn, for thee the sunlight creeps across the lawn. Tracy, under threat of danger during the scenes where she is in the daytime away from her father, culminating with her ultimate untimely death in the daytime, is very, very creepy. There's also a creepy shot, if you think about this. Remember during the whole early sequence, the We Have All the Time in the World sequence, the montage of Bond and Tracy getting together and really forming their relationship. If you notice, there's a really creepy moment where it goes to a shot of the ring in the store window. And then right after, and the Louis Armstrong song is playing in the background, of course, but it goes into the shot of the ring in the store window, which is significant, of course, because this will be the wedding ring that they will use to get married, of course. But if you remember in that early montage, it goes into the shot of the wedding ring. And where does it go next? It goes into a shot of the sun. The film shoots directly into the sun, and the sunlight blares directly at us. And then it goes into the shot of the bears going up and the car driving past, and Bond, Draco, and Tracy are in the car. Again, Bond is on the left, Tracy's on the right, so that's interesting. But my point is that even now we get links with the wedding ring, daytime, and the sunlight. And this is all within the montage of We Have All the Time in the World. If we think about how sunlight and Blofeld are connected, at least how I'm trying to suggest it's connected, I think that's actually a really chilling moment. Another case of foreshadowing and foreboding, one that almost we didn't necessarily expect because it's such a romantic moment, but indeed I think it's there, it's all there. Blofeld, what a character. What an absolutely memorable character. I think he's great. Let's see here. Anyways, thank you very much, Alan, for that great comment. I agree with you. Let's see. Oh, and also, speaking of Blofeld, this is also, the more I think about it, it's really, really creepy. And I'm not sure if the film really meant it, but it is a very creepy moment. And this actually goes into why I think the depiction of Blofeld and the real impact that it has on Bond is actually really creepy. And there are moments of foreshadowing in the film that chills. I really get scary chills. So the moment is when Blofeld is explaining about what Virus Omega is. Remember that whole scene? He said, "Merry Christmas, 007." And I love the detail. I love how he puts the ring on the bit of the glasses. He puts the glasses together and he cracks them into. I just love how Telly Savalas does that moment for some reason. But then he's explaining about Virus Omega. And so what is Virus Omega? We never get a sense of Virus Omega except in what his explanation is. It causes total infertility in not just a particular strand here and there, but an entire species. So it causes infertility. So what is infertility? Infertility is essentially the sort of the inability to procreate, or not procreate, but to have children, right? Or to have a progeny line. And so this is really quite creepy because, in a sense, Blofeld's plan was thwarted, right? Because Bond and Draco came in the nick of time, destroyed Piz Gloria, got all the information they needed, we assume, to stop all those girls, from carrying out Blofeld's plan. Okay, that's fine. But do you remember at the very end, Tracy and Bond, what are they talking about, right? What does he say? I haven't given you a wedding present yet. And what does she say? I had an idea about that. 3 girls, 3 boys. Pleased? So they're talking about their plans for the future. And this is a really significant and creepy point. Really, really chilling. At the moment just before the car passes and they shoot and Tracy gets killed. Remember what Tracy's talking about? She does the thing with the flower and she says, Bond says to her, shut up and don't eat it all at once. And then she says, takes the flower and she says, he loves me. What is it? He loves me instinctively. And she said, infuriatingly. And he says, intensely. And then she's trying to come up with another IN word, in. And he beats her and he says, indubitably, right? I think that's the order. And then do you remember what she says just before we see the car, or just as we see the car drive past? What she says? First a boy and then a girl. Oh, this is so creepy. This is so chilling to me, right? Because, right, if we think of the whole plan of Virus Omega and the whole idea of how it would be, in essence, like infertility. That's what Blofeld says. At the moment where she's talking about children and having children with this love, this man that she has just married, she is killed. And so, in essence, that is a kind of a chilling, I'm not sure if it was done on purpose, but that is kind of really chilling, recalling back to Virus Omega. It's Virus Omega played out on a much more different, wholly dramatically tragic scale. And so even though his plans were thwarted in another way, in a very chilling and tragic way, they weren't thwarted at all, but in fact they succeeded as far as Bond's future life with Tracy was concerned. And I find that to be so heartbreaking, so tragic, but in a very chilling way, kind of connection that we saw from the earlier part of the film. And so whenever people say that the plot, I mean, we never see a lot of the Virus Omega plot play out, but I would point people to this particular connection. I don't know if it was done on purpose, maybe not, but it is still something that is very significant. I mean, the fact that Bond and Tracy spoke about children not once but twice within the span of minutes, and so there is a certain significance to that, I think. But yeah, so this is an indication of how Blofeld is such a really dastardly, such a dangerous foe. Formidable in many respects, much more formidable, arguably, than many of the other Blofelds that we've seen before and subsequently, I would suggest. This is one of the most formidable opponents that Bond has faced because he is relentless. He won't stop. He won't stop until he gets what it is he wants. So I find that to be really... his performance, I think, is the more I think about it, the more I realize that Telly Savalas' Blofeld and how it's portrayed on screen is kind of icy, chilling perfection. And it's dramatically perfect. And it's done so well. But anyway, thank you very much for that, Alan. Great comment. I agree with you. Let's see. So just continuing on. Oh, Cine Arts. Cine Arts is here. So once again, Cine Arts, one word, Cine Arts. Go check out his channel, check out his Bond reviews. He's doing such a great job, much better than me. He's going through them. Nice, detailed, earnest, sincere reviews. Wonderful stuff. So, you say, hi Daisuke, I consider this one of the finest films ever made, and you know how high I would rank it within the franchise. Such a stunning, magical film. Hope you're well today. Thank you very much. Thank you. Let's see. Ben Vanassis here. Hi Daisuke, best Bond story, worst Bond actor. Great supporting cast and set pieces. I love it. You said it very, very well. You all have such a great way with words, my friend. Thank you. And Cine Art says, Diana Rigg as Tracy is my favorite Bond girl. Yes, she is so great, isn't she? I think she is so wonderful. And there are some really quite complex moments about her and her character, which I'll just take the opportunity now just to mention before I move on. But so Tracy, she is going through some kind of trouble, right? According to her father, Draco, right? I think he put it very well. Something was eating away at her soul. We don't know exactly what it was, but something was eating away at her soul. It might have been something to do with the early death of her mother. We're not quite sure, but we understand from Draco's explanation that after her mother's death, she was sent away to school, and then after that she got involved with what he calls the international set, one scandal after another. She got married to someone who died in a Maserati. which I think is also a very chilling, maybe unintentional, but still undeniable sense of foreshadowing. If her first husband died in a Maserati accident, it's very chilling that we find out later that Tracy will die in a kind of car accident at the end of the film. It's not a Maserati, of course, but it's an Aston Martin. But still, death in the vehicle is still something that is apparently a common factor between the first husband and the wife. So, what was that? So, but we understand that there is some kind of maybe deep-rooted emotional trouble and turmoil. And it also might have to do with her relationship with her father, Draco, because we understand that her father, right, Papa, it's one of love, but it's also very testy. She knows exactly what she can say in order to persuade him to do what it is she wants him to do. So we see that moment at the birthday celebration where she says, tell him, Papa, tell him the information that Mr. Bond wants, or you will never see me again. And this is where Draco gives in and says, gives the information about Gumboldt and the connection between Gumboldt and Blofeld, and that leads Bond on into his search for Blofeld, which is another part of the film. But Tracy she knows how to almost, I don't know if manipulate is the right word, but she knows what to say in order to get what it is she needs. But she is also someone that we understand is in some kind of emotional trouble. Some kind of emotional trouble. We're not quite sure what it is, but it's some kind of emotional trouble. Maybe it has to do with her mother, maybe it has to do with her father, maybe it has to do with her first husband. I'm not sure. We're not sure exactly what, but we know that she is in some kind of trouble. And we understand that something about her time with Bond is somehow making her feel better. Now, I'm not sure what we can make of that. Maybe one interpretation could be that this could be another indication of sort of the patriarchal sort of masculine fantasy, if you will, of the idea of men being able to save the day. In other words, the fact that what she needs is a man to dominate her. That's what Draco says. But that could be one way of interpreting it. But another way, I think, and a more another way to interpret that would be perhaps more favorable to the film viewing itself, perhaps, would be the fact that I think honestly it's having to do with the sort of having relationships that last. And, I don't want to dwell too much on this, but I mean, I can certainly sympathize if there's a sense of sadness or even a kind of sense of depression that one might feel if one doesn't necessarily have well-meaning or deep-rooted relationships with one or two or maybe other people around one. And so that could have been the situation, I'm not sure, which could explain, therefore, the fact that the presence of Bond, the presence of James Bond in this relationship really served as, what Draco says, as a kind of therapy for her. But I think we find out that it was much more than that, because it was mutual. And also it was something that led to something that we understood could have been something that could have lasted forever, right? Because after all, we have all the time in the world. So I think, yeah, we don't get all the psychoanalytical details of Tracy's life, but we get some hints or clues as to what it could have been. But amongst that, we also get a character that is very independent-willed, very sharp, very quick on her feet. She knows how to act. She knows how to drive a car. She is very physical. She can fight. She holds her own against one of the big heavies, Blofeld's henchman there at the very end at Piz Gloria, and he holds him off with the broken bottle, and then he fights him. And even when he is obviously physically much bigger than she is, but she is still able to fend him off, scratch the side of his face, use the architecture to her advantage, so much so that she's able to fling him against those spikes at the end and all that stuff. And so she is also very physically very able to handle herself. and she can ski and all that. But it's not just being able to handle herself, but it's being able to handle herself in a way that not only is able to save herself, but also save Bond as well. So it is a very useful, utilitarian way to handle oneself physically. And I find that to be a very strong, appealing point of her character. Which I think adds also to the sort of intelligent dimension to her character. I mean, she's very intelligent. She can match Bond beat for beat, and she knows how to manipulate, as I say, in a very positive way, I think. And we see this also in how she's able to play Telly Savalas' Blofeld at the end there, just enough to give Bond and Draco just enough time with the helicopter advance. And so, with Die Dawn, O Master of the World, Die Dawn. So she is very smart, she's very physically capable, and she is clever, she's witty, and she's played by the one and only Diana Rigg. And so it's just a perfect combination of many different aspects, quite complex, quite brilliant. I should say also that there are some great moments. Well, actually, before I go to that, let me return to a sort of maybe a criticism of this film that maybe revolves around Tracy and has its roots in a sort of criticism that is based upon maybe an interpretation seeing the film as a sort of patriarchal masculine fantasy. And what do I mean by this? We see Tracy being also roughed up quite a bit, quite terribly, in fact, on a number of occasions. So we see one instance where Bond really grabs her wrist when she's got the gun, and she just really physically causes her pain. And in fact, she says, "You're hurting me." He says, "I thought that was the idea tonight," but there's that moment, and then there's the moment where her father essentially punches her in the face when she refuses to leave at the end of the destruction of Piz Gloria, and that's to knock her out and then spare the rod and spoil the child. That's what he says, and then he takes the unconscious Tracy into the helicopter to escape. And of course, there's the fight that he has with one of Blofeld's henchmen in Piz Gloria itself. So there are moments where she's undergoing quite a deal of physical violence from other men in the film, and two of which are among the main characters in the film. And so I think arguably there could be a really reasonably made argument that this is kind of a disturbing, unpleasant view of this sort of masculine or male fantasy of domination to the point of physical violence, which I think is not wholly meritless, but at the same time, one could say that she is also physically very capable of handling herself. And the fact that she was punched by Draco at that very moment, I think is, it could be explained narratively, because this is a moment where the place is about to blow up in about whatever it was, a minute or something like that, and they didn't have time and they had to leave immediately, and there was no other way. She was hysterical, she was refusing to leave, etc. So it could be said that this was something that he thought at the moment he had no other choice to do but, okay. Excuse me, and then the earlier moment with Bond sort of essentially gripping her wrist to the point where she has to drop the gun. This is, maybe narratively, this could be explained away also by the fact that he was just attacked by some henchmen in her hotel room. She is now in his hotel room, and she picks up the gun, which is another interesting thing. Bond is in the background, the gun is in the foreground, so that's another foreground-background connection that I was mentioning earlier. She picks up the gun, and then she's pointing at him, and she says, with the gun pointing at him, "Suppose I were to kill you for a thrill." And he says, I can think of something more sociable to do. And then he grabs the thing in a sort of judo move. But so you could see it as a form of self-defense. And actually, I can actually read that moment that way. But I can understand the other critical way that those moments can be read. But even under such critical interpretations, I think Tracy as a character still holds her own magnificently. Really, really magnificently, and she is clever, she's intelligent, she's very witty, and I love the characterization that Diana Rigg gives. It's sort of a perfect counterpoint, if you will, to George Lazenby's immature Bond, as it were. I mean, the fact that she is the one that Bond marries, almost in a way, it almost helps Bond in our eyes to become the mature Bond that we want him to be, the grown-up Bond that we want him to be, because he could not have been able to get together with a woman like Tracy unless he were more grown up and he were more mature and that sort of thing, because Diana Rigg brings that kind of aura and presence and stature to the role of Tracy. And so I think the fact that she's in this film is one of the strengths of this film. So I agree with you perfectly. Let's see. So continuing on, Cine Art says a mind-blowing John Barry score indeed. Yes, that's very true. And let me just riff on that as well, which is the music is very interesting. This should bring me to the point about the Blu-ray. And the DVD. The DVD is the 2.0 soundtrack, and the Blu-ray is the newer 5.1 stereo soundtrack. So I understand that this was one of the first, or probably the first film that was in stereo. I think I'm not too sure about those details. I'm kind of embarrassed to admit, but this is the sort of the 2.0 soundtrack, which I think is actually very, very good. And it has a kind of, there are sort of quirks of the soundtrack, which I think, to be perfectly honest, are a little bit lost in this particular Blu-ray. This is the Blu-ray set that I have, which also includes my additional disc of Spectre. But as some of you may know, maybe some of you have the earlier release of the 50th Bond or whatever it was, but this is the one I have. So this has the Blu-ray with the 5.1 soundtrack and the new cleaned up picture quality, etc. I have nothing wrong. I think it's great presentation. Don't get me wrong, but I prefer the earlier audio sound because there are some notable differences. We're talking about the John Barry music, for instance. The John Barry music is really great. I think it's fantastic, don't get me wrong, but there are some moments, especially at the end, the final attack on Piz Gloria, where the music cues are a little bit different. Did you notice that? For those of you who know at least as far as I know, maybe this isn't even the version, I'm not sure. Maybe the original theatrical version was completely different. I don't know. I didn't see the original theatrical version, but the version that I always grew up with, I saw on TV, I saw on VHS, and then I saw on this DVD. That was the version that I remember. And the version that I remember had the sounds, for instance, when Bond is attacking Piz Gloria, remember he's sliding down the ice? He's like, he's become a kind of curling kind of thing, and he's sliding with the machine gun and he's shooting some henchmen along the way. This is intercut in between the moments where Tracy is fighting the henchmen. Do you remember this? Tracy fighting the henchmen and the helicopters attacking Piz Gloria. Those are the moments where the James Bond theme kicks in. Did you notice that? I thought that was really interesting. When George Lazenby jumps out of the helicopter and does that thing with slides down the ice, do you notice that at least in the versions that I remember, all the way up to the DVD, the early 2000s DVD, that James Bond theme was cut out. It was silent whenever you had the shot where George Lazenby was sliding down the ice. No more. In the Blu-ray, you actually hear a little bit of the James Bond theme overlaid onto the moment where George Lazenby is sliding down the ice. And I always thought that was a little bit of a shame, because I always like to think that the way that the James Bond theme was used in the audio versions that I was used to up to this DVD release, the way that the James Bond theme was used was such that it was almost like the James Bond theme was being used for moments other than James Bond. It was being used for the action scenes where Tracy is fighting the bad guy and the helicopter's flying over the edge there, and it's a da-da-da-da, and it's not James Bond doing a thing, but it's Tracy fighting the guy. And so I always thought, oh, this is a real James Bond moment. This is the ultimate James Bond moment where she is fighting with the James Bond theme. This is like she is James Bond in a way. And so I always liked that, and it also, gave more fuel to the interpretation that James Bond is a cinematic construct. It is not just one actor playing Bond. It's not Sean Connery. It's not George Lazenby. It's James Bond, right? So I always liked that idea that James Bond was a construct. So much so that the music could be applied even to characters that weren't James Bond. And so I think the Piz Gloria attack is an example of that, which is slightly altered for the new Blu-ray, if you notice, which, well, I mean, it's okay, I don't mind, but there are other changes in the new Blu-ray soundtrack, which I'm not quite sure if I'm used to yet. Some of the really hyped up sounds that we hear in the earlier version. I don't know if you remember, for instance, remember where Bond and Blofeld are fighting on the bobsled, and Blofeld's got Bond there, and he's got the ice is going so fast, the ice wall, and Bond's helmet is hitting the ice wall. If you remember the soundtrack here, at least as far as I heard it, it was really hyper. It was really like you could hear the sounds. The same thing too was when Bond, one of the scientists threw a bit of acid at Bond at the door, and Bond sees the acid basically eat through the door, and you could hear that sound really turned up. Those moments in the Blu-ray that I saw, those moments are really kind of calmed down to the point where they're not really heightened very much. And I really like the heightened unreality of those particular sounds. I thought that really added to the stylized effect of the film, which is kind of lost here. The same is true also for the end with the guns, the bullet sounds. There was a really haunting use of a ricochet. It was like Irma Bunt shooting out, and then and then tung. It was like that at the very end. It was a kind of a ricochet sting, and then we have the George Lazenby. It's Blofeld. It's Blofeld. Here in the Blu-ray that I saw, at least this is the version I have. I don't know. Maybe yours is different. Those ricochet sounds are gone, and it's just kind of sound, and that's it. Maybe you gain something with having a full surround theater. I'm not sure, but I always loved that really exaggerated noise that was used for these moments. I thought it added to the overhyped, stylized effect of the film. Which maybe I have to get used to the Blu-ray 5.1 audio track a little bit more. But those are just some examples that I thought. I'm glad I still have this, but the music is quite wonderful, and I remember that I had the soundtrack, the older CD soundtrack. I think it was maybe released later in a deluxe version. I'm not sure, but whatever it was, I had the non-deluxe version on CD soundtrack, and I just played that over and over and over and over again. I seem to recall. I mean, I don't have the CD anymore. I played it to the point of no return, to the point where now the CD case is cracked. The CD is just scratched beyond repair. But and it had that picture of George Lazenby. It wasn't. You remember that? I don't know if you had the CD, but the older CD cover, and it was obviously patterned after the album, I'm assuming. But that had George Lazenby. It was kind of a weird depiction. It was kind of like it was buffed. It was his features. It was a painting or something, but his features are kind of buffed out. It didn't really look. It kind of looked like George Lazenby. It kind of looked like a slightly erased out version of George Lazenby's painting. I'm not sure, but it was a weird thing of James. But anyway, it had Honor Majesty's Secret Service. It was black with white lettering, and then it had. I loved it. I don't have the CD anymore, but I remember it had, what was it? It started with Louis Armstrong's "We Have All the Time in the World," and it then went into the track with the track that was used at the very beginning, the pre-opening, pre-credit sequence, and then it went into the slow jazzy theme with the casino, and then it went in. The fourth track was then the theme that was used for the second part of the ski chase when Blofeld is chasing Bond and now Tracy down the slopes, and then the fifth track was "Do You Know How Christmas Trees Are Grown," which was really great. I love that song. I really, really love that song. That's such a great song. And then the sixth track, if I remember correctly, was the main theme, the On Her Majesty's Secret Service theme, which is a killer theme. That is really, really great. What a great theme. Probably the best theme aside from the James Bond theme itself. That is phenomenal. What a phenomenal theme indeed, and I love how it's played and replayed, and I also love the James Bond theme itself. It's got that instead of the guitar that was used up to now in Connery, now we've got, I think it's like a synthesizer, like a Moog synthesizer. I'm not sure, but it's now no 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 no. It has that sound to it, which is great, and we hear it for the first time during the gun barrel scene, where we see a little weird thing of the names of the producers in the gun barrel sequence, which is kind of reminding us of how we saw the names of the producers in the first gun barrel sequence in Dr. No, which is interesting. And then we see we hear the John Barry rendition, the new rendition of the James Bond theme played over the gun barrel sequences. George Lazenby walks across and does his James Bond gun barrel sequence on one knee, which is, I think, very symbolic, right? Because this is the one where James Bond essentially, I mean, symbolically, he gets on one knee and he proposes marriage to Tracy. So this is the gun barrel sequence where he goes on one knee. But the music is really quite fascinating and fantastic. And yes, I love it so much. Even Do You Know How Christmas Trees Are Grown? I think that's such an amazing song. But We Have All the Time in the World. A really great one. You notice too, also, I should point out, is that the Blu-ray at the very end, you know, that it has a great way of ending. It has the really haunting reprise of the John Barry orchestrated version of We Have All the Time in the World, the final bars, and then cutting in on the shot of the broken, the bullet hole through the windshield. And then it goes into kind of a triumphant James Bond theme with sort of cymbals and then like a tuba or trumpet or something, and then it does the thing, and it goes into the credits as they scroll on the left side of the screen with the bullet hole on the right side of the screen. And if you notice, there's a little bit of a weird cut, and the Blu-ray actually edits the music differently. If you listen carefully, it's a different cue that's used in between the very obvious edit that's used in the music, the way they're trying to edit in the end credits. So it's a little bit different. So I'm not quite used to the Blu-ray yet, because there are some subtle differences in the way that the sound effects are used and also the music is edited that I'm not quite used to. But I think those are probably minor points. I think overall we can still enjoy the music, the John Barry music, very well. Yeah, so anyway, thank you very much. Thank you. Let's see, so just keep on going here. Let's see. Iacona 23 is here, and you say the novel and the movie are very, very close. Yes, yes, make no mistake about that. Yes, I agree. I've read the novel many times. There are differences, yes, but you say they are minor. I agree. I agree. They're actually, well, I don't want to go into too much detail, but yeah, I agree with you. Let's see. All right. Yes, and there's mention here about John Glenn. The Rhino Autobot says, my favorite Bond film. Cooper Glover 1972 says, it's not your typical Bond film. The romance between Tracy and Bond really touches me. Let's see. And yeah, Sculder22 says, I wonder how people would take Lazenby if he made more, like or hate more. I mean, we can only speculate at this point, but I have a hunch that we would have seen a harder-edged Bond, a much harder-edged Bond. I mean, that was the trajectory that we saw. That was the only way I think we could have seen his Bond go in another film. So I think we can get a sense of how that might have turned out. Again, if we think about other films in the series later on, License to Kill comes to mind. Quantum of Solace also comes to mind. So I think we have gotten a kind of Quantum of Solace type of film. But again, we'll never know. We can only speculate. But excuse me here while I have a quick drink. Oh, Alan Negrello says, the film has one of my favorite Bond gadgets, the suitcase-sized safecracker copy machine. Glorious. It was great, yes, so large. And I loved how it took time. It took so much time for Bond to do it. He had to sit there and wait. I mean, and there was I guess the adult magazine there to keep him company, I suppose. But I loved how that was taking its time, and it was huge and is unwieldy. It was really wonderful, and the music too was great. Speaking of music, that's great. I think that track that was used during the whole breaking open the safe, right? It's a really wonderfully suspenseful track. I don't think it was included in the original release of the soundtrack of the film. It wasn't on the early sort of non-deluxe version that I had. I love that soundtrack. I love that piece of music very much. It had that synthesizer edge to it. Oh, great stuff. Absolutely great stuff. Tomahawk 238 says, would have been interesting to see a more true to the novel version of Diamonds Are Forever with Lazenby. I agree. We're speaking of novels. I mentioned earlier that perhaps one of the weaknesses I saw in the film was that the filmmakers were trying to make continuity connections with the cinematic Bond of the past that went up all the way through to You Only Live Twice, which doesn't make sense in the continuity, because that would mean that Bond and Blofeld would have been able to recognize each other, but they don't seem to do so in this particular film. So that seems to be an inconsistency in terms of the continuity, and I totally get that. But if we remember the novels, the novel that came in terms of the Blofeld series of novels, there was Thunderball, and then The Spy Who Loved Me, and then there was On Her Majesty's Secret Service. So in actual fact, if we discount The Spy Who Loved Me for a moment, I think we can say that this story kind of follows a little bit more comfortably after a story like, say, Thunderball, because we know that Thunderball was this grand adventure that involved the entire world on the brink of destruction, and Spectre and all that stuff. And so, but Bond and Blofeld might not necessarily have known each other at that particular point in time. And so it makes more sense, therefore, in terms of a continuity, that the story on Her Majesty's Secret Service comes after Thunderball. And so I think it's a little bit of an interesting thing that it comes after in terms of the film universe. You Only Live Twice. There's a similar sort of thing that happens in terms of Dr. No and then From Russia with Love versus the novels, or From Russia with Love and Dr. No. Some of you, for those of you who know the novels, you'll know what I'm talking about. How those are connected in the film universe versus how they're connected in the novel universe. But but anyway, and I guess anyone who hasn't read the novels, strongly suggested. They go by really quickly. They're very fast moving, and very exciting, and a lot of detail goes into those novels, and the sort of details that Fleming weaves into the narrative. Okay, let's see. Just scrolling down here. Wolfcrat says, I did wonder what the guy would think when his Playboy disappeared. Yes, because he took the magazine away. Yes, so that's one of the great mysteries we'll never know, right? Because those little details, actually, those go against the art of spycraft, right? Because the art of spycraft means that you want to make sure that your presence could never be detected. And so that, like, in other words, if you touch something, you have to put it in the exact same place you found it, or that sort of thing. And so the idea that Bond takes the magazine away, it kind of seems to be going completely antithetical to the whole notion of spycraft. But oh well. Maybe he didn't notice. Maybe he didn't notice the magazine was there in the first place. Maybe it was one of his clients. Who knows? But anyway, we'll never know the answer to that. Let's see. All right, just scrolling down. Let's see. Iacona23 says, back in the 1990s, I used to argue with people who ranked this as the worst Bond movie because of Lazenby. That was the consensus of all these lists. I'm so happy to see the film be reappraised. Yeah, that's interesting. I always thought that this film was actually really up there. It was, for me, it was definitely either 1, 2, or 3 for me. And, I could always change them around, but even now, it's up there. It's if it's number, it's could be number one, but if it's not number one, it's certainly one, two, or three. It's definitely up there, but and it's always been up there. I think it's great because of a number of the factors that I tried to explain during the course of this live stream. But Mark L says, I don't smoke, but if I did, I would hold my cigarette like Blofeld survives. Yeah. Yes, it's a really interesting way. Yes, that little, and I love how he holds it. He's going like this, and he says, um, um, you know, yeah, I just, oh gosh, what a great way that he holds a cigarette. Yes, and then the George Wolfgrat says the George Baker dub of Bond in disguise was far more passable as well. It might be, I suppose. And I love the line. Irma Bunt, it's a very classic line. Irma Bunt says, after he's there at dinner with with Ruby next to him, and Ruby writes in lipstick, I think, her room number on Bond's inner thigh, and Bond is noticeably agitated by this, and so Irma Bunt says, is there anything wrong, Sir Hilary? And what does he say? Just a slight stiffness. So I thought that was very interesting. Let's see. Yeah. Okay. Let's see. Oh, Cooper Glover, speaking of those girls, Cooper Glover 1972 says, the girls that Bond sees at the clinic is your typical Bond formula, but then it really gets more personal and intimate with Tracy, and I got to say, it really touched me. Yes, that's a really good point. There's an interesting contrast between the people at Piz Gloria and Tracy and her characterization. I think it's really great. Vershil Patel says, if only Sean Connery was in this one, this would be the best Bond film. That's an interesting kind of speculation, which I've thought about a lot over the many years that I've encountered this film. And I think there's a lot to be said about that kind of thinking, very much so, especially when we understand that Connery wanted to maybe. He had enough of Bond, and this had a kind of more dramatic pulse to it that could have attracted Connery more. It had a different, fresh approach as well. It was a kind of more down-to-earth sort of Bond, more in league with the Bonds that we saw from Terence Young as well. And so we understand that Terence Young being the director of the first Bond films from Eon, Dr. No from Russia with Love, and then not Goldfinger, of course, but then Thunderball. So there could have been a lot there, of course. Question, of course, whether the continuity would have been affected. After all, this is the same Connery Bond that just came off of the events of You Only Live Twice, so that might be a little bit strange to have a same plot with the same Connery Bond, but with Blofeld, Savalas's Blofeld, and I don't know how that might have worked. It also might have been maybe to the point where Connery being in a Bond film that was the biggest franchise on the planet would have meant that they couldn't go back. So every film was just building off on each other to the point where it had to be bigger and better than the one before. And so that the fact that On Her Majesty's Secret Service is so much quieter than You Only Live Twice seems to suggest that maybe Connery being in the film probably might not have resulted in the same type of film that we ended up with now. So I think all the speculation is really great. It can go in many different directions, I think. Of course, when we see Connery again, we see him in a completely different kind of Bond in terms of approach and tone. And hopefully one of these days, if we're up for it, I'd love to talk to all of you about Diamonds Are Forever, but Guy Hamilton's Diamonds Are Forever. But I guess it would have been really interesting to see Connery in this role if it were to be the exact same type of film that we saw with Peter Hunt, the pared down gadgets, the back to basics sort of plot, the love story with Diana Riggs Tracy. And the like, and so and Telly Savalas's Blofeld, who doesn't recognize Bond, and the like. And so I think it could have worked, but it has to be, the only variable must be Connery, and everything else must be constant. Otherwise, I think you would have had a different sort of picture altogether, and we're not quite sure how that would have turned out. Remember, of course, too, that the producers weren't necessarily resistant to changing major plot points of the novels. I mean, we saw pretty much, for more or less, we saw a lot of consistency, more or less, between the books and the film adaptations. Dr. No, more or less. From Russia with Love, more or less. Goldfinger, more or less. Thunderball, sure. But then You Only Live Twice was the first time we get, I mean, I don't want to go into too much detail, but the book is drastically different than the film version. It's drastically different. And so, I mean, there are some similarities, I suppose, but it's actually very, very different. And so, and the continuity is different because it comes in a later order. The order of the books is different than the order of the films. And so, my point is that I think at this point, had Connery continued, there would have been the possibility, at least, that if On Her Majesty's Secret Service had been chosen as the next Connery Bond film, it could have been another situation where the producers could have been open to the idea of changing around the storyline quite a bit by bringing in a different screenwriter, a writer that was not Richard Maybaum, right? Who is it for You Only Live Twice? Roald Dahl, right? So. Anyway, again, there's a lot to think about with that, but I think everything else being equal, I think I agree with you 100%. Let's see. There's that. Mainly Movie says, not many gadgets in this one, but at least he's got his pockets to rip out. Yes, the pockets that he rips out in order to climb out onto the frozen cables there, which I always thought was very interesting, you know, how he's climbing out. That's another foreshadowing moment. Remember when he's climbing out there and the moving gears, that always reminded me of the opening credits, right, with the clock motif, and you see Bond hanging off of the moving hands. That's almost like Bond hanging off of the cable car wire cables, you know, about an hour or so into the film. So I thought that was really, really cool. Also, I should mention as a sort of miscellaneous point, before I forget, this is a kind of, how should I put it? What is it? I was mentioning the use of James Elroy Flecker, which is Thy Dawn, O Master of the World, Thy Dawn, for thee the sunlight creeps across the lawn, and et cetera, et cetera. And this was used, of course, by Tracy in order to kind of distract Blofeld, kind of, from having his attention be focused in on the helicopters that are passing through the airspace. And so I think this is an interesting motif that's used, because in essence, Tracy is using poetry as her kind of weapon against Blofeld in order to distract him. So in a sense, you could say that, you know, poetry is her weapon, or what is the phrase? You know, the pen is mightier than the sword, in terms of, right, the idea of the words that are being spoken have more power and effect than a kind of physical threat or weapon that can be used. And I think there's a lot to be said about that adage and this particular moment that Tracy uses in order to use poetry to, in a sense, distract Blofeld. So poetry is in a sense her weapon. So yes, it is a dangerous thing if one thinks about it, which I think is very interesting, because that's turned on its head at the film's end, because Bond and Tracy are driving and they stop along the road there because of the flowers, right? Say it with flowers, and right, he says, you know, he has a point. We do look like an ad for a flower shop. And so he gets out of the car very slowly, very nonchalantly, and then walks around removing the flowers very sort of leisurely, without any sort of sense of hurriedness or rush. One thinks that had he rushed more, I mean, how could he have known what was going to happen in a few moments later? But one would like to think that maybe if he had hurried it along and then gotten into his car quickly, then this whole tragic end wouldn't have taken place to begin with. And so I think there's something to be said about the leisurely brisk pace that he, or leisurely slow pace that he has when he's taking off the flowers and he's talking to Tracy. And what does he say, which is really interesting? He says, Tracy says, you have given me a wedding present, the best guy could have, the future. And she's looking out kind of outside the window. And then James Lazenby says something interesting. He says, Mrs. Bond, shut up, in a very playful way, of course, not in a demeaning way, but in a playful way. He says, shut up and don't eat it all at once. So that's interesting. He's asking her kind of to not say anything. But what does she do after that? She goes on and says stuff. She loves me, or he loves me. Instinctually, instinctually, infuriatingly, intensely, indubitably, right? And so all that stuff is also them talking. So it's almost in a way a reversal of the Tracy Blofeld poem that was used to Tracy's advantage. Here, the Tracy Bond talk is very playful, also a kind of poetry, if you will, a sort of playful, flirtatious sort of poetry. But this time we realize that it's actually being said in a way that is taking time away from Bond. So it probably meant those extra seconds that allowed Irma Bunt and Blofeld to make their attack. So in a really kind of ironic sort of way, in that way, too, the pen was mightier than the sword. In other words, the words that she was saying created just enough stalling time for Bond to not react as quickly as he could have in terms of taking the flowers off, etc. So there's an interesting little, I don't know, maybe one could make more of that in an essay, I'm not sure, but there's an interesting way where for Tracy, the pen is indeed mightier than the sword, in the sense that words indeed have power and are dangerous, sometimes to her advantage, but at other times to her disadvantage. So anyway, let's see here. And I love before I go into the comments, before I forget, that end sequence, of course, is foreshadowed very early on in many different moments in the film. I mentioned at the very outset, with the pre-opening, the pre-title sequence, we see Bond looking through the sight, the gun scope. And so it's essentially Tracy's head is in a sense in the sight of a gun, which is a very chilling foreshadowing for what happens at the very end, of course. Then later, when Bond and Tracy are in the car and they're being chased by Irma Bunt and Blofeld's men after he's escaped from Piz Gloria, and there's a moment where they're trying to find a telephone, a payphone. They're driving by part of the town, and there's a church, right, or church bells or something, or some bells are going off as they're driving by, almost like bells of a wedding. Right, so they're driving by, and then they're going, and then Bond goes finds a payphone, is trying to call. I think he's trying to contact London, but he doesn't do so, because at that precise moment, the bad guy's car comes up, and then you see Irma Bunt from the back shooting with her machine gun, and so that's another sort of moment. Again, we'll see her from the back of a car with her machine gun again later in the film, which also has a wedding motif, which again we heard at this earlier moment with the wedding, with the church bells, which remind us of a wedding. But let's see. Anyway, yes. All right. So. Wolfgrat says the plot is just a MacGuffin, really. Worse than usual. Okay, that's fair enough. But as I was trying to maybe argue or debate earlier, I think there is a simplicity, but I think the simplicity of it means that the actual struggle between Bond and Blofeld comes to the fore. And also the simplicity allows for sort of indirect ways in which foreshadowing can bring us different ways of looking back and seeing how things that we saw in the film leading up to the final moments actually held different meanings. I bring your attention to Virus Omega, and then also the foreshadowing that I mentioned earlier. But this also brings to the point the fact that, in fact, what this does is the fact that because the plot is in a sense really quite simple, it makes the Bond-Blofeld dynamic the main part of the struggle or the tension between the antagonist and the protagonist in the film. And this is expressed, I think, of course, very vividly in the action sequences. I mean, and we are involved in the action sequences not because they will directly fuel or affect Blofeld's plan or anything like that, but they are just essentially, the good guys trying to get away from the bad guys, and this time it's on skis and with machine guns, and skiing through, the Willy Wagner ski chases, which are, I think, among the best chase sequences in any Bond film, which is really wonderful. I love the bit right where one of the it's the ski. I want to say, what is it? It's the right foot ski of Bond is sort of shot off, and so he can't use it anymore. So he throws it away, and he skis with one ski, which I thought was really great. I always thought that was kind of, and this is probably a bit of a stretch, I know, but I always thought it was kind of an interesting little symbolic thing where Bond is sort of incomplete because he has one ski, but when he goes down to the town, who does he see but Tracy? And then that's the moment when they escape and he proposes to her. So it's like it's like one becomes two, and so there's a uniting again. So I thought that was really interesting. But I know that's probably wasn't the intent of having Bond ski down with one ski in the first place. But I thought I always thought that was such a cool moment. What a cool ski sequence that was, and then the aerial photography for the second aspect of that ski chase, because it's kind of divided into two, right? We have the first element of the ski chase with him actually skiing down the mountain face from Piz Gloria and through the trees and everything, trying to make it to the town. And then the second part is after the storm, the next day, with Tracy and Bond escaping the barn, Blofeld in hot pursuit, of course, but we get the wonderful slow shots of the aerial photography, the Johnny Jordan aerial photography, that I love that wonderful visual contrast, because the first ski chase sequence was fast, and there was a lot of gunshots and a lot of skis and darkness and moving around. And here the second part is very almost high above and angelic and almost very calm, and it lets us very slowly get back into the rhythm of the proceedings, which I thought was really great. But I love that. I love that very much. Yeah. And oh, great. So now going back here. So there's a discussion about his being undercover at Piz Gloria as Hilly, yes. Right. Respect the faces here. Hello, it's nice to see you. And let's see. Mainly Movie says, I love the Lazenby reveal in this one. It's kind of reminiscent of the slow reveal of Bond and Dr. No, right, until the Bond James Bond line. But then this one has got the self-aware comedy, which is great. Yes, self-awareness comes in at the very end, the sting at the very end. This never happened to the other fella. But you're right, in terms of the way in which the editing and the montage closes in on parts of Bond rather than the whole face of Bond, so to speak, and we see that in the casino scene at the very start of Dr. No, as you rightly point out. So it's also important to keep in mind too that Peter Hunt was kind of almost like Terence Young's almost protege in a sort of way, and so it's only fitting, I think, that Peter Hunt took cues from how Terence Young introduced James Bond in the first James Bond film. But very interesting. Well done. I agree 100%. Just scrolling down here. Yeah, just scrolling down here. There's a great... yeah, good. Let's see. Oh, while I'm scrolling down, I also should mention Gabriele Forzetti as Marc-Ange Draco, so the head of Union Corse, and the largest criminal syndicate, or one of the largest. It's now been eclipsed by Spectre apparently, but and he says, Spectre, yes, Blofeld, some of my men recently defected to him. So this is where we get the information about Tracy and about Blofeld and about Draco and all this stuff at the early part of the film, and which is supposed to be the 13th as we understand it. But there's an interesting moment. I don't know if you noticed this, but Gabriele Forzetti is dubbed, right? And and so whenever he's speaking, it's not really the actor's voice. You can tell because it's dubbed by another actor's voice. But I don't know if you noticed, there is a point in the film where we actually can hear Gabriele Forzetti's actual voice, and this is in the scene between Bond and him at the early part of the film, and when I've never seen it actually acknowledged by anyone, but you can really tell. I mean, there's a similar moment with Gert Frobe as Goldfinger. Gert Frobe as Goldfinger in the film Goldfinger, as you know, was dubbed by another actor whose voice was not Gert Frobe's, except for one moment in Goldfinger. There's a very clear moment in Goldfinger, the film, where you can actually hear Gert Frobe's voice being used as he is saying a line in the film, and it's still in the film, and so you can probably tell where it is. But there's a similar kind of thing that happens here with Gabriele Forzetti. So his voice, he's dubbed for the most part, except one moment, and it's the moment, I think, and again, I've never seen it acknowledged, but I think it's his real voice. I've heard it many times, but when he's talking about Tracy, and he says, he reveals that, when Bond is talking about his dossier, and then Draco says, your dossier on me is not quite complete, and Tracy is my daughter. And, Bond says, oh, Tracy. And then Draco says, yes. And it's this moment when he says, my only child. My only child. You listen to that voice, and it's his voice. It's not the dubbed actor's voice. It's his voice, and so you can tell, because you can tell that it's not that there's a separation between dubbing dialogue and then dialogue that's actually recorded on the set. You can tell that this is probably dialogue that was actually recorded there, and the voice is different. So I thought that was such a good, and what a deep, rich voice that is. It's really good. I always thought that Gabriele Forzetti, in an interesting way, almost has the rugged features of Sean Connery himself. He almost looks like Sean Connery, kind of older statesman like Sean Connery, which I thought was really interesting. It was almost like there's an older gentleman who looks like Sean Connery talking with a younger man who's playing a role that used to be played by Sean Connery in a film that is, in a way, maybe from the perspective of some people anyway, is hurt by the fact that Sean Connery isn't in the film. And so I always thought that it was an interesting thing that made the Bond-Draco relationship dynamic even more sort of meaningful. Maybe the filmmakers maybe didn't necessarily mean it for it to turn out that way, but I always thought that was really interesting. And also, I mentioned before, the Draco character fills in the M character in many ways, of course, because the Draco character is the one who kind of gives Bond his assignment in the first part of the film. M doesn't give him an assignment. In fact, M in this film is the one who takes away the assignments from him. All he does is give him 2 weeks leave. So the M role by M is quite diminished, at least the role that we understood it to be through the first 5 films anyway. That M role that we understood it to be in the first 5 films is in a way filled in by the Draco role. And I actually like Draco as well. He's one of the more likable allies that we've met in a Bond film up to now. And Gabriele Forzetti's performance, I think, is quite magnificent. What was I going to say? I mentioned also M and how his role is diminished And the same goes for Q, and the same goes for Miss Moneypenny. But in fact, while their roles are being diminished, what's interesting is that the other aspects of their characters, their private lives, the way they interact with each other, those are being augmented, or they're being increased. So for example, we see M at his home, his large home. It's maybe a country manor or something like that. We see M and Moneypenny and Q, or we see M and Moneypenny and the rapport together, because we understand that indeed it was Miss Moneypenny who saved the day, diffusing the tense situation where Bond was about to quit Her Majesty's Secret Service. And so we understood that probably M was in on it too. M kind of knew that Bond wanted to quit, but Miss Moneypenny saved the day by just changing the memo to, instead of asking for resignation, just asking for 2 weeks leave. And then M knew it, which is why he radioed in later and says, what would I do without you, Miss Moneypenny? Thank you. And so I think that's a lovely, tender moment between M and Miss Moneypenny, which I don't think we've seen hitherto. Which is really lovely. And that tenderness is actually carried through very nicely in the final wedding scene, where we see M, Q, and Miss Moneypenny as guests of the wedding, which I always thought was rather interesting. I never understood, is this something that would be consistent with the world of spycraft and espionage and the British Secret Service, right? Because I always thought maybe I was just thinking about this too much, perhaps. But I always thought that the British Secret Service relied on secrecy, and you didn't necessarily have any relationships. Well, I guess, but at the same, I was going to suggest that maybe the British Secret Service was such that you wouldn't necessarily socialize outside of the day job, right? But the fact that they are at the wedding means that they're probably engaged in some kind of socializing, perhaps. But at the same time, there is a relationship in terms of a military relationship. We understand that they were in the military or something like that, and so we understand that, or not the military, but the Navy, I think it was. We understand it later, but the point is that that there is probably some kind of relationship in terms of sort of a military rank relationship. And so I think probably the fact that they can be seen socializing isn't necessarily out of the norm in terms of people who work in the Secret Service. But again, I'm just speculating because I've never been in the Secret Service. But all those details aside, and again, I'm probably wrong, but all that aside, I think it's really nice and very poignant to see M, Q, and Moneypenny in this film in different roles than what we've seen them occupied in the 5 other Connery films. We see them interacting, socializing, congratulating Bond. I love the little moment between Q and Bond, especially. There are times when I thought you were irresponsible. Irresponsible, yes, that's exactly the word, right? This time, my boy, I can't complain. I love how he says, this time, my boy, I can't complain. What a nice sense of camaraderie between the two of them. And if there's anything you need, just what a lovely touch. And I think that also is something that is, if we think about how this film on Her Majesty's Secret Service could be seen to have a sort of sequel in spirit, if you will, in the film License to Kill. And if we think about how there's the Bond-Q relationship in License to Kill, I think there's a nice sense of continuity between how Q and Bond are interacting, even if it's for a short moment in On Her Majesty's Secret Service. There's something really lovely about that. And speaking of lovely, I love how M emerges as a sort of gentleman's gentleman, and he's talking with Draco and about the 64 bullion job. You made away with quite a portion of the payload or something like that. And so they're talking about gentlemen's terms about something that they were probably on opposite sides of that particular situation. He on the the British government side and Draco on the criminal side, but they're now talking like gentlemen, and it was just a game or something like that. And I love that sense of self-knowledge that both of them exhibit, especially M, because he's always been so ultra serious in the films up to now. I think for the most part anyway, but here he's letting his guard down, he's relaxing, he's having a drink, and he's almost just enjoying it. It's like he's acknowledging that it's a game, which I think is an interesting twist on the M character up to now, which I think is fascinating. And then, of course, there's Miss Moneypenny, and this is almost in a way the closing of the arc of the Bond-Moneypenny relationship in a way. From here on out, we'll see a kind of different dynamic to the Bond-Moneypenny relationship, I would suggest. It may be, up to now, it's always been a flirtatious, romantic, maybe not romantic, but a flirtatious relationship. Of course, one can speculate who was exhibiting more of the flirtatious energy. Was it Bond or was it Miss Moneypenny? Who knows? I mean, it's up to you to decide. But the point is, it was definitely, there was some kind of flirtatious energy between the two of them there, and but that was all. And then it would always be punctuated by the throwing of the hat onto the coat rack there, and then this culminates in this film where we see, of course, Bond getting married and Moneypenny, of course, being disappointed, heartbroken, and then the hat being thrown as a final gesture, as a kind of final goodbye, right? Moneypenny crying, but of course she always cries at weddings, as she says. But my point is that this is a really nice closure to that arc, the Bond Moneypenny arc, and I think it's really poignant and lovely. And I say it's a closure because if you know the Bond Moneypenny relationship from Diamonds Are Forever, Live and Let Die. And then the Moore films, and then on through the end of the Moore era, and then of course we'll have different actors playing the Miss Moneypenny role. But the Lois Maxwell Miss Moneypenny, I think, has a different dynamic with Bond from Diamonds Are Forever onwards. And so I think that this is a kind of closure to that flirtatious Bond-Moneypenny relationship arc. And if it is, then I think it's a very poignant and very fitting one, and kind of a bittersweet one in an interesting way. So I really loved it, and really great. Anyway, let's see. Let's see here. Okay. Let's see. Just scrolling down, and barn. Let's see. Yeah, I'm at the part of the discussion where we are talking about the, what is it? The treatment of Tracy by the various men in the film. It's certainly very interesting. Let's see. Oh, respective phase. Move your mic up a hair, my friend. Okay, sure. What's that? How's that? Okay. Let's see. Manly Movie says his audio sounds fine to me. Oh, great. I can never tell, but let's see. Now there's quotes about the interaction between Bond and the girls at Piz Gloria. Let's see here. All right. This is a good conversation, my friends. Yes, yes. Mark L says Lazenby as a villain in a future Bond film would be a nice twist. Oh, it's interesting, yeah. Let's see here. Now, All right. Raymond Rodriguez is here. Only film that we see how James Bond met and married his wife. We also have only one Lazenby Bond. Don't forget, it takes almost 3 films to become that character. To Connery to get to Goldfinger. Yes, yes, that's true. Yes. Let's see here. Okay. Oh gosh, I just lost my spot here. Well, let me just try to find my spot again. Here, just give me 1 second here. And then we can slowly begin to wind down. All right. Uh-oh. All right, sorry about this. I'm just trying to find my place here. There's a lot. Let's see. Okay, so damn full idealistic crusader says the on Her Majesty's Secret Service Blofeld is the only hands-on version of the character. Thus, he is more like Largo from Thunderball, right down to leading his men personally. Yes, yes, I agree. Yes, I agree. That's yes, I agree 100%. Markel says, can't say there are many Bond, many Blofeld, might be many cats. Gung Fu, oh, hello, Gung Fu, hello. Let's see, and Damnful Idealistic Crusader says, the sun behind Blofeld is one of those moments in On Her Majesty's Secret Service that makes it different. It was likely a combination of Peter Hunt wanting to break free of formula, what Michael Reed having some, Michael Reed being the director of photography, having some really interesting new ideas visually, and being one of the great artistic triumphs of 1969 and the emerging pushback against studio era releases. I agree, and I'm sure you'll agree also that that's an example of that kind of fresh, invigorated visual style, highly stylized visual flair that the film has. Really, really great. Let's see. Wilram says, another connection. Dawn in French is l'aube, which is pronounced like lobe, earlobe. That's brilliant. Randy Powell says, this is the one with Emma Peel in Out the Avengers. So you're referring to Diana Rigg, right? So as Tracy in this film, yes. Wilrem says, Tracy at night, her reappearance feet first when Bond is at his lowest. You're talking about when Bond is trying to hide out and he's at the skating rink, right? The whole do they know how Christmas trees are grown? This whole sequence is one of the highlights of all Bond. I agree. I absolutely agree. And I think it's really great. I agree 100%. Let's see. All right. So I'm just scrolling down through the chat here. There's a lot of great things going on here. Mainly Movies says, I think Tracy is one of the strongest, capable Bond girls. She and Pussy Galore have always been some of my favorites. from the franchise for that reason. Yes. Let's see. And now I'm at the part of the conversation about the audio soundtrack. Yes, yes, I have some issues. Yeah, and Damn Fool Idealistic Crusader says maybe you and I have similar thoughts about this, but the 5.1 makes a lot of music errors as well as all the remixes do. Peter Hunt was responsible for using the James Bond theme in the early films, much to John Barry's consternation. Yes, but there are some errors, kind of timing errors, in the way that it's used in the earlier mixes. But I always thought that those are really kind of charming. But let's see. All right, just scrolling down. Wrestling Buff 87 says, honestly, I think Lazenby was perfect for this film due to the vulnerable nature of the character, and I wish he had at least done Diamonds Are Forever. I agree. I absolutely agree. That's really good point. Oh, interesting. And then Darcy Murray has a similar point. I wonder how Diamonds Are Forever would have turned out if Lazenby returned. I feel like it may have been better. Considering how much of the budget was used to convince Connery to return. Yes, yes, perhaps. Damn Fool Idealistic Crusader says, Gumbold Safe was the reason I ran out in 2003 and bought my first expanded CDs of On Her Majesty's Secret Service and Thunderball. Yes. Yes, I think that's a reference to the soundtrack conversation. Let's see. And then Damn Fool Idealistic Crusader continues. Connery in On Her Majesty's Secret Service could have been great, but by 1969, I don't know if it would have worked given his misgivings with the producers. The really interesting ideas are Moore and Dalton, which were each possibilities, but Dalton himself acknowledged he was too young. Yes, I understand that. I think I agree with you about the timing. I mean, if it would have been interesting if On Her Majesty's Secret Service had been made after Goldfinger. That would have been, I think, really interesting. Although one has to speculate, would it have been the same story with the same approach that Peter Hunt gave to it, or would it have been a wholly different thing entirely? I mean, one can only speculate. But I mean, we would have, by that time, you know, we would have had the Blofeld. The Blofeld thing was pretty much established anyway, and so. It could have worked in terms of the continuity through Goldfinger, but I think that would have been the best time to do it. But you know, fate sort of turned a different corner, and so fate and Kevin McClory turned a different corner, I suppose. But let's see. Okay, so I am now just scrolling through the chat, and it's almost 2 a.m. where I am, so I think we are about, do I have anything more that I can say? Hold on, there we go. Do I have anything more that I can say? I'm not sure, but let's see. All right. Cooper Lover 1972 says, also, how can Tracy pull into the barn when the windshield is covered in snow? My brother always wondered about that. That's a good point. Yeah, that's an interesting point. I guess they could have seen a little bit through, perhaps, but, you know, they weren't driving so fast, but I guess they couldn't because of the snow. But that's a good point. I'll have to check that out again. Let's see. Zyrother says, Blofeld is cheap when it comes to equipment and henchmen. Banging sound system, though. A real party with those speakers. Yes, and the lighting, too. Don't forget the lighting. That's a real party pad in terms of the lighting, that's for sure. Oh, it's great. Let's see. Yes, there is a discussion here of Gabriele Ferzetti and Diana Rigg. That's right, Diana Rigg was recently made an appearance in Game of Thrones, I think. Yes, that's right. I don't watch that series that much, but I know of her appearance. And let's see. And I think that is the end of the chat, I think. Oh yes, Will Rem says, thank you, about the novels. Bond and M socialize in the novels, mostly gabbling. Yes, thank you very much for bringing that up. That's right. That's an interesting thing, you know, like how yeah, I guess so, because if this is because that's such an interesting thing I didn't really talk about as much as I would like to today, which is this is a film that is really meant to be an adaptation of the novel, a really close adaptation of the novel. But as you know, the novel's chronology and the novel continuity is much different than the film continuity or the Eon Productions film continuity. And so there are a lot of inconsistencies that come up if one tries to integrate the two continuities. And I see this film as an attempt kind of to try to integrate the two continuities, but not really succeeding. But I don't think that's in any way a fault of the film necessarily. It's just the fact that the films were shot in the order that they were shot in. But yes, so okay. All right, so I think we are about finished. At least I am just going to wind down my discussion of On Her Majesty's Secret Service. So if you have any last minute questions or comments you want to bring my way, you have a few minutes here. Randy Palace says, Daisuke, do you think that Ian Ogilvy would have been be good as Bond? Oh, it's interesting, perhaps. It's interesting, maybe. Oh gosh, I never thought about it, but it could be interesting. But yeah, but I think there are a number of actors that could be good Bond. But yeah, that's probably something that we can talk about in a future video, perhaps. But that's a good question, though. I like the question. And let's see, I think we are done. So it's now past 2 minutes past 2 right now. So what I will do is I will just wind down the discussion. So with that in mind, my friends, what I want to stress is that I think that the film On Her Majesty's Secret Service, excuse me, just let me have one sip of water. Thank you. So, excuse me, the film On Her Majesty's Secret Service is a unique, one-in-a-kind, one-off in many respects. It is also a film that is trying to link to the continuity of the Bond films that came before it. Whether it succeeds on that front, I'll leave it up to you to decide. As a film itself, though, there are many things within the universe, painted within the frames of the film itself, that really are electrifying. They are very in keeping with the spirit of James Bond as we saw in the novel. It is also a very thrilling cinematic construct of a character that is an action hero, that is a complicated action hero, and that is thrust into these complicated situations, in these situations that are unique to the universe of Bond, at least in the film universe anyway, and that cause many different ripples throughout the remaining films or the films that are to come, because as I say, this is an extra added dimension and layer to James Bond like we've never seen it before, and it's a very sharp, tragic, and deeply wounding turn that we see. And I think it's for that and for other reasons that I think this film on Her Majesty's Secret Service is really one of the best. It is absolutely electrifying in terms of as an entertainment, as a James Bond film entertainment, and as a gripping story that I think is filled with a lot of thematic and stylistic connections and connectivities that make for a really great example of exciting, enthralling cinema, as well as being an electrifying entertainment. And so this is one of the best Bond films for me. I never grow tired of this film. I see it many, many times, and I think I will continue to do so, because it never fails to engage me and to make me interested more and more into what it might be saying and what it has to offer. So with that, my friends, this is 1969's On Her Majesty's Secret Service. So thank you very much. And with that, my friends, so that's it for today. And I want to say that, first of all, what I'd like to do is I'd like to say that I think this went okay. So let us say, I don't know when we can do the next one. I will schedule it as soon as possible. But what I'd like to do is I'll make an announcement later. But I was very much taken with some comments I received from some viewers and friends with respect to what film we could talk about next. And so where do I have it? I have my DVD here, but I just can't find it right now, but so please forgive me. So if we look in these sort of nondescript Blu-rays that I have, the next film I want to talk about is this one, which is called The Living Daylights. So The Living Daylights is the one that I will talk about next in this Bond, what do you call it? The Bond series live streams, whatever it is. So we will talk about The Living Daylights next. When exactly that will be, I will announce soon. I'll try to make it as soon as possible. It'll probably be in its own schedule. And so I will let you know. I'll try to give you as much time. But if you're interested, it might be as early as a week from today, kind of, maybe. I'm not sure. But when I decide and when I figure out my own schedule, of course, I will let you know. And so please, if you're interested and if you want to join us for another one of these, please watch The Living Daylights. This is Timothy Dalton. A really exciting one. 1987? Do I have that right? 1987. And so this is very, very exciting. Again, a new Bond, but this time Timothy Dalton as James Bond. And I think it's a very underrated, really exciting. One of my favorites, actually. So I'll try to just talk a little bit about that at the next James Bond related live stream. And speaking of live streams, I know there's a lot going on, so I apologize for all the information. But next Saturday, we will be doing not a James Bond film, but the film next Saturday will be Before Sunset. So next Saturday, what's the date? Today's the 16th, so the 23rd of May. Do I have that right? So May 23rd, we will be talking about, what do you call it? Before Sunset. So this is the Richard Linklater film. And so this will be, again, same time, Saturday, 11 p.m. Tokyo time. So we spoke about Before Sunrise some time back, a week ago, right? And so next week we will be talking about Before Sunset. So if you're interested, please feel free to join us then. It's a slightly different film than On Her Majesty's Secret Service, but perhaps there are some similarities, who knows. In any event, if you're interested, I'd very much love to see you at that live stream where we will talk about Before Sunset. And I will make an announcement again about that very soon on this channel. So stay tuned for more information. With that, my friends, thank you very much for your time, and thank you very much for your energy and your great input. I'm sorry I couldn't get to everyone's comments today. I did my very best, but as I say many times, you know, my best is oftentimes not good enough. But we will strive for better next time. So next time will be Before Sunset, and the next Bond film will be The Living Daylights. And I will set the schedule. I will write it out and be as clear as possible as soon as I figure it out. So and Randy Pell says, Dicey, can you review The Crow sometimes? Okay, I'll think about it. I can't make any promises, but I will certainly think about it, and I mean that. So, and so let's see. So Scalders22 says, goodbye. Zerother says, take it easy. Thank you very much to all of my friends who are here or who might have left early. That's okay. Thank you very much. Have a great rest of your day wherever you are, my friends. Take very, very good care of yourselves. That is the most important thing during these times. Take very good care of yourselves and your loved ones, and stay strong. And as always, we will beat this thing that is currently gripping the world. And so just stay strong and stay safe, my friends. And I will talk to you again very, very soon. Until then, thank you once again, and cheers. All right, so that's it. Okay. So we are done. So thank you very much. And let's see. Okay. All right. Oh, thank you. That was okay. Oh, so this was about 3 hours. Again, not quite to the level of our dear friend Damn Fool Idealistic Crusader. I still can't reach, what is it, 5-6 hours, but yeah, that's yeah, 3 hours is probably the max I can do with these things, but I'll try to improve my stamina, but it is also late, so. Oh gosh, so that means The Living Daylights is next, so when am I going to watch that one? Maybe it'll have to be sometime later this week. And so but it's not too long, right? So it's less than 2 hours, as most of these Bond films are, and so that shouldn't be too much of a. And it's also fun to rewatch The Living Daylights, as I say. So that should be exciting. And of course, Before Sunset too. I'm also very excited about this. I should let you know that I don't know how I'll feel tomorrow, but after the discussion of Before Sunrise, the next day I was kind of in a daze because I was a little bit. I think that took a lot out of me in a good way, of course, but that felt very. I felt like I said what I wanted to say, but I still felt very, very spent of energy afterwards. And so I feel somewhat similar after On Her Majesty's Secret Service. Maybe it's just maybe it's the current climate of the world. Maybe I need to rebuild my stamina up a bit, but I will certainly do my best. But anyway, sorry for this rambling, and I will see you all later, my friends. Cheers.